Somewhere around the 2nd century BC, a Jewish scribe, writing in Aramaic, most likely somewhere near the hills of Judea, put to parchment a story that had already been circulating among his people for generations. It was not a new story. The bones of it were already sitting inside Genesis chapter 6, in a passage so strange and so brief that most readers stumble past it without stopping. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves. 11 words that theologians have argued over for more than 2,000 years. I've spent a long time sitting with those 11 words, and every time I come back to them, I feel the same thing, that the text is pointing at something it refuses to fully name. The name the ancient world gave to those beings was Irin, watchers. It comes from an Aramaic root meaning simply the awake ones, beings that do not sleep, do not rest, do not stop watching. The term appears in the Book of Daniel, when King Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man on earth at that time, describes a dream in which a holy one descends from heaven and speaks a decree. He calls it a watcher, a holy one, not a servant, not a messenger, a watcher, something categorically different. And what is documented in the Book of Enoch, a text that fragments of were physically recovered from the caves at Qumran near the Dead Sea, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, meaning this was a text Jewish communities in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC were preserving and reading as sacred. What that text describes is 200 of these beings standing on the summit of Mount Hermon and making a pact, and they swore an oath together. Their leader, named Shemihazar in the earliest Aramaic manuscripts, said plainly, "I fear that I alone will bear this sin." And they all swore together that they would descend, that they would take human women as wives, and that not one of them would carry the weight of it alone. What follows in that account, the offspring, the forbidden knowledge they spread, the weapons, the cosmetics, the writing, the sorcery, the teaching of astrology, and the movements of the moon. All of it is documented across not just 1st Enoch, but corroborated in the Book of Jubilees, in fragments from the Damascus document, and threaded through the Dead Sea Scroll prayers found in Cave 4 at Qumran, where the community that copied these texts wrote their own incantations specifically against the spirits they believed descended from these unions. These were not abstract theological ideas for them. These were living threats that they prayed against by name every day. What I find myself returning to, and what I want to work through carefully in this documentary, is the question of what the Watchers actually represent in the architecture of the biblical text. Because the earliest scholars who engaged this material, men like George Nicholsburg of the University of Iowa, one of the foremost academic voices on 1st Enoch in the 20th century, argued that the Book of the Watchers is not mythology for mythology's sake. It is a serious attempt by Second Temple Jews to answer a theological question that the Torah never directly addresses. Why do people sin? Why does the pull toward destruction exist inside human experience at all? The answer the Enochic tradition gave was that something entered human history from outside it, something that was not supposed to be here, something that was awake when it should have stood its post. I want you to read the passage in Genesis 6 again tonight after you watch this. Not quickly, but slowly, the way you'd read something that you know contains more than it shows. Because what I found in tracing the full documentary trail of the Watchers, from the Aramaic original through to the New Testament references in Jude verse 6 and in Peter's second letter, where fallen angels are described as confined in chains of darkness reserved for judgment, is that this story never actually left the canon. It was woven into it. It just required knowing where to look. If this kind of deep text-rooted biblical history is what you come here for, the single best thing you can do is subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because every documentary I put out builds on the last one, and what's coming next connects directly to what you've just heard. There is something about the night that makes the old stories feel closer. When the world grows quiet and the lights go low, I find myself drawn back to the ancient texts, to the questions that have no easy answers, to the beings that exist just at the edge of what we can fully understand. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere most people have never really explored, even if they think they know the Bible inside and out. We are going to look together at one of the most mysterious classes of beings ever described in sacred literature, beings called the Watchers. You may have heard the word before, perhaps in passing, perhaps in a film or a book, but I promise you, the real story is far older and far stranger than anything modern culture has done with it. These are not characters invented by Hollywood. They appear in ancient texts, in scripture, in manuscripts pulled from desert caves, and in the writings of scholars who have spent their entire lives trying to understand what the ancient world believed. So let me sit with you for a while tonight, and let me share what these texts actually say. We'll take this gently, piece by piece, the way these old stories were always meant to be told, around a fire, in the dark, with patience. Now, the first thing I want to do is take you directly to the biblical text, because that is where our story begins. If you open your Bible to the Book of Daniel, the 4th chapter, verses 13, 17, and 23, you will find something that most casual readers pass right over without a second thought. In the middle of a dream that the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar has, a figure appears. The text calls this figure a watcher, and in the original Aramaic language in which this part of Daniel was written, that word is Ur. It is a specific title, a designation for a particular kind of celestial being. What is remarkable is that Daniel uses this word as though his audience already knows what it means. No lengthy explanation is given, no introduction. These beings are simply referenced as a known reality, holy messengers who carry divine decrees. The watcher in Nebuchadnezzar's dream comes down from heaven and pronounces judgment on the king. It is a dramatic moment, and the watcher here is unambiguously holy, unambiguously aligned with God's purposes. Here is where something really interesting opens up for us. The word in Aramaic comes from a root meaning to be awake or wakeful. Scholars who study the original languages tell us it essentially points to a being that does not sleep, one who watches constantly without rest. Think about that image for a moment. While we sleep, while the world rests, these beings remain awake. They observe. They are sentinels of the cosmos, placed at their posts in the divine order. Now, this title, Watcher, does not only appear in Daniel. When I turn to a text called the Book of Enoch, which is not part of the Protestant or Catholic Bible, but which was deeply important in ancient Judaism and early Christianity, I find the Watchers described again, this time with far more detail. 1 Enoch, chapter 1, verse 5. And then the opening of chapter 6 describe watchers stationed on a mountain, beings of great power and great responsibility. The text of 1 Enoch is not a single book written at one time. Scholars like George Nicholsburg, who wrote the landmark Hermoniah commentary on 1 Enoch in 2001, tell us that the earliest section, known as the Book of Watchers, was likely written around the 3rd century before the Common Era. That places it firmly in what historians call the Second Temple period of Jewish history. a rich and intensely creative era of theological thought. What I find so striking is that these two portraits, Daniel's holy watcher and Enoch's more complex ones, are not simply the same thing. This is one of the first things I want you to hold in your mind tonight, because it matters as we go forward. In Daniel, the watcher who appears before the king is sent by God, obedient, serving the divine council's purposes. That is a very different picture from what first Enoch will eventually unfold. The Dead Sea Scrolls are one of the great archaeological treasures of the 20th century, discovered beginning in 1947 in caves near Qumran by the Dead Sea. Among those scrolls, researchers found fragments of First Enoch written in Aramaic. They are catalogued as 4QEN, meaning they came from Cave 4 at Qumran. This tells us something extraordinary. The community that preserved those scrolls, a devout Jewish sect living in the desert around the 1st century before the Common Era, considered First Enoch a text worth copying, preserving, and studying. The Watchers were not a fringe obsession. They were woven into serious religious thought. And that lineage of serious thought is exactly what we are following tonight. Now let me offer you a bigger picture, because understanding the Watchers requires understanding something about how the ancient Israelites and their neighbors thought about the structure of the universe itself. We tend to think of God governing the world directly and alone, with nothing in between. But the ancient worldview, the one reflected in these texts, was more layered than that. The scholar Michael Heiser, in his carefully researched 2015 book, The Unseen Realm, makes a compelling case that the Hebrew Bible itself reflects a belief in a structured divine assembly, a heavenly court where God presides and where divine beings carry out specific functions and assignments. The Watchers fit into this framework. They are not random wanderers. They hold a rank, a position, a function within the cosmic order. Think of them as a specialized class within the divine hierarchy, not ordinary angels carrying messages, but beings assigned to watch, to observe, to oversee. This is the role they were given. This is what makes their later story, which we will unfold in the chapters ahead, so weighted with consequence. When a being with that much responsibility and that specific an assignment steps outside that assignment, the implications reach everywhere. One more thing I want to share with you before we move on, and it is something I find genuinely remarkable. The Watchers, as described across these texts, Daniel's Aramaic scripture and First Enoch's ancient narrative, are not low-level spiritual beings. They are not minor functionaries. The language surrounding them carries the weight of authority and proximity to God. In Daniel, the Watcher speaks with divine authority, announcing judgment. In First Enoch, the Watchers are described as having stood in God's presence. This is a class of beings imagined to occupy an extraordinarily high place in the created order. And yet, the tradition that develops around them is ultimately a story about how even the most elevated of created beings can make catastrophic choices. That contrast, the height from which they came, and the depth to which some of them fell, is what gives the Watcher story its particular gravity. It is not a story about creatures who were always dark or always destined for ruin. It is a story about beings who were given something extraordinary and chose to abandon it. I also want to be clear with you about something, because honesty matters in how we handle these old texts. The word watcher itself does not appear in the English translations of Daniel as a proper noun in all Bible versions. Many translations render the Aramaic simply as a holy one, or an angelic watcher, so you might read right past it without realizing you have just encountered one of the most significant titles in ancient angelic lore. The specific word, in its original Aramaic form, carries that full weight of meaning. The wakeful sentinel, the one who does not rest, the celestial observer. When I read Daniel chapter 4 carefully in the original language traditions, the Watcher is presented as a being of genuine cosmic stature. It announces the decree that will humble the most powerful man in the world. It speaks on behalf of heaven's council. It is not a minor presence, and it is entirely holy. This is why any responsible exploration of the Watcher tradition has to begin right here, in the canonical scripture, and in the biblical text itself, before we move into the richer, more complicated territory of First Enoch and the traditions that built upon it. Now, what does all of this mean theologically? How should we hold these ideas? I think the honest answer is that the Watchers ask us to sit with a kind of mystery that does not resolve easily. The texts come from different times, different contexts, and different communities. Daniel was written for a Jewish community under tremendous political pressure in the 2nd century before the Common Era. First, Enoch was treasured by desert communities who were themselves deeply concerned with questions of evil, suffering, and cosmic order. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian traditions in the world, actually includes First Enoch in its Bible. It is canonical scripture for those believers. Most Protestant and Catholic traditions do not include it, classifying it as pseudepigraphal, meaning it was written in the name of the ancient patriarch Enoch, but not by him. And yet even those traditions have to reckon with the fact that the New Testament itself acknowledges Enoch's writings, as we will discover later in our story. All of this is to say, these texts deserve respect, careful handling, and honest labeling. Tonight, we are not trying to prove or disprove anything. We are trying to understand what people believed, why they believed it, and what that belief produced. As I think about what we have covered tonight, I want to draw it together gently for you. We have met the Watchers, this remarkable class of celestial beings who appear first in the Book of Daniel as holy, obedient servants of the divine will, described in Aramaic with a title meaning the wakeful ones. We have seen that this title connects to a broader tradition preserved in First Enoch, a text whose oldest section likely dates back to the 3rd century before the Common Era, and whose manuscripts were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have understood that the Watchers occupied a specific and high-ranking position in the ancient vision of cosmic order, not simply messengers, but sentinels, observers, beings entrusted with a particular divine function. And we have been careful to distinguish between the holy Watchers of Daniel and the more complex portrait that First Enoch will paint. That distinction matters. The story we are about to follow is not a simple one, and honoring its complexity is the only honest way to tell it. There is one more thing I want to leave with you before we move to our next chapter, and I want to say it softly because I think it carries real weight. The Watchers are not a footnote in ancient literature. They are not a curiosity found in one obscure text buried in a cave. They appear across multiple traditions: Aramaic scripture, pseudepigraphal writing, Dead Sea manuscripts. And they left their mark on how both Jewish and early Christian thinkers understood the structure of the heavens and the nature of celestial beings. As we move forward, we are going to explore the world those Watchers inhabited, the divine council, the cosmic hierarchy, the ordered structure of heaven that made their eventual choices so significant. What I want you to carry into rest tonight is simply this: before there was a fall, there was a height. And to understand the full story of the Watchers, we need to understand the order they were part of before anything went wrong. That is exactly where we are headed next, into the ancient vision of the divine council, the heavenly assembly, and the place the watchers held within it. Let me paint a picture for you, not from imagination, but from the texts themselves. Imagine a great assembly, a council gathered in the heavens. At the center sits the God of Israel, presiding as a judge presides over a court. Around him stand divine beings, powerful, purposeful, each carrying responsibilities that stretch across nations and peoples and the unseen structures of the world. This is not a scene from mythology that ancient Israel borrowed carelessly. This is a picture embedded in the Hebrew Bible itself, preserved in texts that scholars and theologians have studied for centuries. I want to walk you through that picture tonight, because without it, the story of the Watchers makes only partial sense. The Watchers had a place within this divine order. They were part of something structured, something intentional. And to understand how extraordinary their later story is, you first have to see what it was they belonged to and what it meant to hold a position within it. The place I want to begin is Psalm 82. Open your Bible to that psalm and read the very first verse. It says, in words that have startled careful readers for generations, that God stands in the divine assembly. And in the midst of that assembly, he pronounces judgment on the other Elohim. That word, Elohim, is the same Hebrew word used for God throughout the Old Testament, and here it is applied to other beings gathered in council. The psalmist is not confused about monotheism. He is reflecting an ancient Israelite understanding that God presided over a structured court of divine beings, beings who held delegated authority and who could be held accountable. Now, I want to be clear. This is a text that has been interpreted in many ways. Some traditions read the Elohim here as human judges, given that Psalm 82 later quotes God calling them sons of the Most High. But many scholars, including Michael Heiser in The Unseen Realm, make a careful case that the most natural reading, especially in its ancient context, is that these are genuinely celestial beings, members of a divine council. There is another passage I want to bring to your attention, because it adds something important to this picture. In the book of Job, chapter 1, verse 6, we read that the sons of God, in Hebrew, Bnei Ha-Elohim, came to present themselves before God. Among them, the text tells us, came the figure known as the adversary, the high Satan. What strikes me about this passage is its matter-of-fact tone. The ancient writer does not stop to explain who these sons of God are, or why they are assembled before God. The scene is simply presented as a given reality. A council convenes, its members appear, and God speaks among them. This same quality appears in 1 Kings chapter 22, verse 19, where the prophet Micaiah describes a vision of God sitting on his throne with all the host of heaven standing beside him to his right and to his left. Heaven, in the ancient Israelite imagination, was not an empty space where God sat alone. It was a populated, ordered court, and that court had members with specific roles and responsibilities. Now, here is something that I think is genuinely worth pausing over. The Dead Sea Scrolls, those extraordinary manuscripts discovered in the Judean desert, preserve a version of Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8, that differs meaningfully from the standard Hebrew text that most of our English Bibles are translated from. The version most of us read says that God divided the nations according to the sons of Israel, but the Dead Sea Scrolls version reads sons of God. That difference is not a minor spelling variation. If the older reading is sons of God, it suggests that the nations of the earth were apportioned among divine beings. Each nation assigned its celestial overseer, while Israel remained God's own portion. This reading is actually supported by the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, which also reads sons of God in that verse. Scholars mark this as a disputed textual point, and it absolutely is. But I find it remarkable that when we follow the older manuscript evidence, the picture of the divine council becomes even more structured, even more explicit. The Watchers fit precisely into this kind of world. Divine beings assigned to specific domains, specific peoples, specific responsibilities. The Ugaritic texts are something I want to mention briefly, because they help us understand that this was not a uniquely Israelite idea. Ugarit was an ancient city on the Syrian coast, and the texts discovered there, catalogued as the Keret and Baal cycle tablets, including what scholars call KTU 1.2, describe the divine assembly of the Canaanite pantheon, centered on the god El. El presides over his council, just as the God of Israel presides over his. Now, I am not saying these are the same God, or that Israel simply borrowed Canaanite theology wholesale. The differences are enormous and theologically significant. What I am saying is that the framework of a divine council, a structured heavenly assembly with a presiding deity and subordinate divine beings, was the common cosmological furniture of the ancient Near East. Israel lived in that world, thought in that world, and the biblical writers engaged with it rather than ignoring it. Understanding this helps us read texts like Psalm 82, not as embarrassing relics of a more primitive theology, but as sophisticated engagements with deep questions about how God relates to the cosmos and what structure the heavens hold. Let me draw your attention to what this means for how we think about the Watchers. If you accept that the Hebrew Bible reflects a genuine belief in a divine council, presided over by God, populated by divine beings with real authority and real responsibility, then the Watchers are not an alien idea imported from a fringe text. They are a logical extension of what the canonical scriptures themselves suggest. They are a named, specialized class within this council structure. Daniel's Watchers serve the council's purposes. First, Enoch's Watchers were commissioned as part of this same ordered hierarchy. The scholar Michael Heiser describes this framework as the divine council worldview, and he argues persuasively that it was not peripheral to Israelite theology, but central to it. When I read the canonical texts through this lens, I find that a great many passages that seemed puzzling before begin to make a different kind of sense. God is not diminished by sharing governance with other beings. Rather, his authority is shown in the fact that he presides over, judges, and ultimately governs all of them. What is also worth noting tonight is how this divine council functions as a kind of cosmic accountability structure. In Psalm 82, God does not merely observe the divine beings. He judges them. He accuses them of failing in their responsibilities. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? This is a remarkable accusation. These beings had been entrusted with something, the administration of justice among the nations, and they had failed. The psalm ends with God rising to judge the earth, taking back the governance that these beings had mishandled. I find this passage quietly devastating in its honesty. Even those closest to the divine throne, even those given extraordinary authority and proximity, could fail in their charge. And that failure had consequences not just for themselves, but for the people they were meant to serve. This pattern, divine beings entrusted with sacred responsibility, choosing wrongly, and the consequences spreading far beyond themselves, is exactly the pattern we will see unfold in the Watcher story as we move forward. From a theological standpoint, I want to be careful and honest about how to hold all of this. Different Christian and Jewish traditions have varying levels of comfort with the divine council framework. Some read the Elohim of Psalm 82 as human judges and find no celestial beings there at all. Some traditions have been so shaped by a strict monotheism that any suggestion of other divine beings feels threatening to the uniqueness and sovereignty of God. I respect those traditions, and I want you to know that this is genuinely contested interpretive territory. What I can say is that the scholars who engage most carefully with the original languages and the archaeological context, people like Heiser, like John Collins, who wrote the landmark Hermoniah commentary on Daniel, consistently find that the divine council framework is embedded in the texts themselves, not read into them from outside. You can hold your own theological convictions and still find this ancient picture illuminating. Understanding what people in the ancient world believed is not the same as being obligated to believe it yourself. As we come toward the close of this chapter, let me gather the threads we have been following tonight. We have seen that the Hebrew Bible, in Psalm 82, in Job chapter 1, in 1 Kings chapter 22, and in that remarkable variant of Deuteronomy 32, preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, reflects a consistent picture of a divine council. God sits at the head of this council, presiding over other divine beings who hold delegated authority over specific domains. The ancient Near Eastern world shared a similar cosmological framework, as the Ugaritic texts make clear, and the Watchers, those wakeful celestial sentinels we met in our first chapter, belong to this structure. They are not anomalies. They are members of an ordered hierarchy, serving specific functions under divine authority. That is the world they inhabited. That is the role they were given. And that orderliness makes what happens next all the more significant. Now I want to carry you gently toward our next chapter, because what we have built tonight is the foundation for everything that follows. We know who the Watchers are, beings whose very name means the wakeful ones, whose presence in Daniel carries divine authority, whose fuller portrait begins to emerge in 1 Enoch. And now we know the world they inhabited, a structured cosmos, a divine council, a heavenly assembly where God presided, and where divine beings carried responsibilities that touched the lives of nations and peoples. The question that hangs in the air as we move forward is a simple but weighty one. What happens when beings in that kind of position, with that kind of proximity to the divine, step outside what they were made to do? The answer to that question is written in one of the oldest and most contested passages in the entire Bible. 6 verses in the Book of Genesis that have sparked theological debate for over 2,000 years. That is exactly where we are headed next, and I think you will find it unlike anything you expected. I want to take you to a very specific place in the Bible tonight, a place that is easy to read past quickly, a place that seems almost impossibly brief given the weight of what it contains. We are going to sit with just 4 verses. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. 6 sentences of ancient Hebrew text that have generated more theological debate, more scholarly argument, more divergent interpretation than almost any comparable passage in all of Scripture. When I first really stopped and read these verses carefully, not quickly, not as a prelude to the flood story, but on their own, I was struck by how much they assume, how much they leave unexplained, and how deliberately spare they are. The ancient writer is not telling us everything. He seems to expect that we already know something about what he is referring to. And that expectation, that quiet assumption of shared knowledge, is itself a clue about how old and how widely known this tradition really was. Here is what the text actually says, and I want to give it to you plainly. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive. and they took as their wives any they chose. Then verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. That is it. That is the entire account. No explanation of who the sons of God are. No explanation of where the Nephilim came from or what exactly they were. No moral commentary from the narrator beyond what follows in verse 5, where we read that the wickedness of humanity had become great. The text drops this extraordinary claim into the narrative and moves on, leaving the reader to wrestle with it. And wrestle people have. For more than 2,000 years, the phrase sons of God in Hebrew, bene ha Elohim, is the same phrase we encountered in Job chapter 1, verse 6, where the sons of God assemble before the divine throne. That connection matters. When the ancient audience heard this phrase, they were drawing on a shared vocabulary, a shared set of associations. And the earliest interpretations of Genesis 6 that we have on record, interpretations that predate Christianity and that come from within Jewish tradition itself, understood the sons of God here as angelic or divine beings, not as human men. The Book of Enoch, chapters 6 and 7, which scholars date to the 3rd century before the Common Era, takes this interpretation and builds an entire narrative around it. The Book of Jubilees, chapter 5, verse 1, another ancient Jewish text, also reads Genesis 6 this way. She describing the descent of the sons of God as an act that violated the divine order. These early readers were not reading something into the text that was not there. They were drawing on a tradition of understanding that the text itself seemed to support. Now, I want to be fair and honest with you, because this is genuinely contested territory. There are 3 major ways that scholars and theologians have interpreted the phrase sons of God in Genesis 6, and all 3 have serious people behind them. The first interpretation, the oldest and earliest attested one, is that the sons of God are angelic or divine beings, heavenly beings who descended and took human wives. This interpretation is supported by 1st Enoch, Jubilees, and as we will discover later, by some early church fathers like Justin Martyr. The second interpretation, which became dominant in Western Christianity, largely through the influence of Augustine in the 5th century, is that the sons of God were righteous men from the line of Seth, Adam's 3rd son, who intermarried with women from the corrupt line of Cain. This is often called the Sethite interpretation. The third interpretation, which has also had its advocates, understands the sons of God as ancient kings or rulers, powerful men whose tyranny and excess contributed to the corruption of the world. The scholar Klaus Westermann, in his landmark commentary Genesis 1-11, published by Augsburg in 1984, treats this passage as an ancient mythological fragment that the biblical writer incorporated into his narrative. Each of these readings tells us something about how differently the same text can be heard, depending on one's theological framework and historical context. What I find fascinating, and I mean genuinely fascinating, not just academically interesting, is the way the angel interpretation held such dominance in the earliest period of both Jewish and Christian thought. We are talking about a span of several centuries during which the most serious and learned readers of the Hebrew scriptures consistently understood Genesis 6 as describing a transgression by heavenly beings. Justin Martyr, writing around 150 of the Common Era in his second Apology, chapter 5, takes it entirely for granted that angels sinned with human women and produced offspring. Tertullian, one of the most important theologians of the early church. She wrote in similar terms. These were not credulous men reading carelessly. They were sophisticated theologians engaging with the text in its historical context, within a world where the Watcher tradition was still living and widely known. The shift away from this interpretation came later, and it came in significant part because of Augustine, who argued in The City of God, chapter 15, section 23, that the sons of God must be the Sethites and that the daughters of men came from Cain's line. Augustine's reading carried enormous weight in Western Christianity, and it shaped what most Protestant and Catholic readers today assume is the obvious meaning of the text. Now let us look at the word Nephilim, because it carries its own mysteries. In Hebrew, it is Nephilim, Nephilim, and even scholars who have spent careers studying Hebrew are not in full agreement about what the word means. One school of thought derives it from the Hebrew root meaning to fall, which would make Nephilim the fallen ones. Another reading connects it to a root meaning something like the extraordinary ones or the overwhelming ones. The ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, renders Nephilim as gigantes, giants, and that translation has had an enormous influence on how these beings have been imagined ever since. What the text of Genesis chapter 6, verse 4 actually says about them is that they were mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. That description, mighty men, men of renown, sounds more like legendary warrior heroes than biological monsters. But the tradition, fed by first Enoch and later by Numbers chapter 13, extended the image considerably. Numbers chapter 13, verse 33, brings the Nephilim back into the narrative at a startling moment. The Israelite spies sent by Moses to scout the land of Canaan return with their report, and 10 of the 12 say these words: "We saw the Nephilim there, the sons of Anak who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." This is a fascinating reference because it comes centuries after the flood, in a narrative where the Nephilim were supposed to have perished. Scholars have noted that this reference may reflect the spies' fear and hyperbole more than a literal genealogical claim. They were terrified, and they reached for the most frightening name they knew. The Jewish tradition later connected certain unusually large inhabitants of Canaan, including figures like Og of Bashan, mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 11, to this same Nephilim lineage. These connections are classified as traditional interpretation rather than straightforward canonical claims, and it is important to hold them with appropriate care. The biblical text is sparse. The tradition built around it is rich and sometimes embellished. Here is where I want to offer a moment of theological reflection. Whatever interpretation of Genesis 6:1 ultimately settles on, divine beings, Sethite men, or ancient kings, the passage functions within its larger narrative context as an explanation for why the world had reached such a state of corruption that God would act in the catastrophic way described in chapters 6 through 9. The union described in verse 2 and the offspring described in verse 4 are placed immediately before the statement that the wickedness of humanity had become great and that every intention of the human heart was only evil continually. The text is building a case. It is explaining how things got so bad, so quickly, that the world required a flood. Now, the scholar John Walton of Wheaton College, in his 2018 book, The Lost World of the Flood, published by IVP Academic, argues that the Nephilim are best understood as a class of warrior tyrants, powerful, violent men whose dominance characterized the pre-flood world, rather than as supernatural hybrids. That is a serious scholarly position, and it shows that even without accepting the angel interpretation, the text is pointing to something extraordinary and deeply troubling about the state of the ancient world. As we draw this chapter toward its close, I want you to feel the weight of what we have been sitting with. 6 verses. Just 6 verses in Genesis, and within them, enough ambiguity, enough ancient depth, enough theological tension to sustain 2,000 years of debate and still not be resolved. That is not a weakness in the text. It is, I think, a sign of how old and how layered this tradition is. The sons of God appear, they take wives, and from that union come beings who are described as mighty and renowned and as Nephilim. The earliest readers of those words understood them to be describing something cosmic, something that breached the boundary between heaven and earth. That reading shaped the Book of Enoch. It shaped early Jewish apocalypticism. It shaped early Christian theology about angels and demons. And whether you ultimately embrace it or not, understanding it is essential for understanding everything else we are going to explore together. What we have seen tonight opens the door to the next part of our story. Genesis gives us the seed, the brief, ancient, tantalizingly sparse account of the sons of God and the Nephilim. But the tradition did not stop there. Writers, thinkers, and communities took those 6 verses and asked, who exactly were these sons of God? What drove them to this act? What did it cost them? And what did it cost the world? The text that tried to answer all of those questions in breathtaking, sometimes startling, deeply imaginative detail is the Book of Enoch. It is a text that most people have never read, but whose influence has touched the New Testament, the early church, and the entire history of how humanity has understood the origin of evil. That is exactly where we are headed next, into the world of Enoch, its origins, its authority, and the extraordinary reason why even the New Testament itself could not ignore it. There is a book I want to introduce to you tonight that most people have never held in their hands, never read a page of, and yet whose ideas have quietly shaped some of the most familiar passages in the New Testament. This is the Book of Enoch, not the Gospel of John, not the letters of Paul. This ancient text, written in the centuries before Jesus was born, left marks on the New Testament that scholars have been tracing carefully for generations. I want to be upfront with you about what this book is and what it is not, because how we hold it matters enormously. It is not in the Bible most of us grew up with. It is not in the Protestant canon. It is not in the Catholic canon. But it was read, studied, quoted, and cherished by serious Jewish and early Christian communities during the period when the New Testament itself was being written. And one New Testament writer, just one, actually quoted it directly as prophecy. That fact alone tells us this book deserves our careful, respectful attention. Enoch is attributed to a figure we meet very briefly in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 5, verses 21 through 24, describes a man named Enoch, 7 generations from Adam, who walked with God for 365 years. And then the text says, he was not, for God took him. He did not die in the ordinary sense. He was simply taken. That mysterious ending to Enoch's life made him a natural figure for later writers to build upon. If Enoch walked so closely with God that he was taken directly into the divine presence, then what might he have seen? What might he have been shown? The ancient writers who composed the text we call Enoch answered those questions with extraordinary imagination and detail, writing in Enoch's name, a literary practice common in the ancient world that scholars call pseudepigraphy, meaning the text is attributed to a famous name of the past. The name signals the authority and antiquity of the tradition being recorded, not necessarily the literal authorship of the text. Now, what do scholars actually tell us about when this book was written? The scholar George Nicholsburg, whose 2001 Hermonia series, Commentary on 1st Enoch, is one of the most thorough academic treatments of this text, makes clear that 1st Enoch is not a single unified work. It is more like a collection, a library of related texts gathered under Enoch's name. And within that collection, the earliest section is what scholars call the Book of Watchers, which spans chapters 1 through 36. Nicholsburg and other specialists date this section to approximately the 3rd century before the Common Era. That means it was written several hundred years before Jesus, during a period when Jewish communities were wrestling deeply with questions about cosmic evil, the origin of suffering, and the nature of the heavenly world. James Vanderkam, another major Enoch scholar, whose work, Enoch, A Man for All Generations, published in 1995 by the University of South Carolina Press, remains a foundational text, traces the tradition even further back, suggesting that some of the themes and material in the Book of Watchers may draw on traditions even older than the 3rd century composition date. Here is the moment that I think makes everything about 1st Enoch impossible to simply set aside. Open your New Testament to the short letter of Jude. It is near the very end, just before Revelation, and it is only 1 chapter long. Read verses 14 and 15. Jude writes these words: "It was also about these that Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied, saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones, to execute judgment on all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him." That is a direct quotation. Jude is quoting, almost word for word, 1st Enoch chapter 1, verse 9. He attributes it to Enoch as prophecy. Now this is classified as canonical scripture. Jude is in the New Testament. And within it, Jude treats the words of 1st Enoch as having prophetic authority. This does not mean every Christian tradition must accept the entirety of 1st Enoch as inspired scripture, but it does mean that at least one New Testament writer considered this text to carry genuine weight. That is not a small thing. The Dead Sea Scrolls give us something equally remarkable from an archaeological standpoint. When scholars examined the cave, 4 materials from Qumran, the community near the Dead Sea, whose library was discovered beginning in 1947, they found fragments of 1st Enoch written in Aramaic. These fragments are catalogued as 4Q201 and 4Q202, among others, and they represent the oldest surviving manuscript copies of the Book of Watchers. The community that copied and preserved these texts was not a casual group of readers. The Qumran community was a deeply devout, rigorously disciplined Jewish sect living in voluntary desert exile, intensely focused on purity, scripture, and preparation for a coming cosmic judgment. The fact that they invested the effort to copy and preserve 1st Enoch tells us unambiguously that they regarded it as a serious, authoritative text, worth studying, worth passing on. When I sit with this archaeological reality, I feel the weight of just how significant this tradition was for ancient communities, who were grappling with the same questions about evil and the heavens that people still grapple with today. There is one community for whom 1st Enoch is not extra-biblical at all, and I want to make sure we honor that reality tonight. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, whose tradition traces back to the 4th century of the Common Era, includes 1st Enoch in its biblical canon. For Ethiopian Orthodox believers, this is not a supplementary curiosity or a historical artifact. It is scripture, part of their Bible, read and studied with the same reverence given to Genesis or the Psalms. I find that worth pausing over. The history of which texts became canonical and which did not is itself a complex historical story, shaped by council decisions, community debates, geographic distances, and theological priorities. First, Enoch's exclusion from the Western biblical canon was not a verdict on its worthlessness. It was the outcome of a particular historical process, one that the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition resolved differently and with just as much theological seriousness. What exactly is in the Book of Watchers, those first 36 chapters of 1st Enoch, that made it so important to these ancient communities? At its heart, it is a story. It is an extended narrative account of who the Watchers were, what they did, why they did it, and what happened as a result. It takes the sparse 6 verses of Genesis chapter 6 and fills them in with names, motivations, dialogue, divine responses, and cosmic consequences. It names the leaders of the Watchers. It describes their descent. It catalogues the forbidden things they taught humanity. It follows the archangels who were dispatched to respond. And it traces the chain of consequences from that original transgression all the way to the flood and beyond. For communities living in the Second Temple period, wrestling with why the world contained so much evil and suffering, this narrative provided a framework. It located the origin of evil not simply in human sin, but in a cosmic rebellion that predated and precipitated the worst of human wrongdoing. I want to offer a thought here about how to hold the authority of this text honestly. First Enoch is what scholars classify as pseudepigraphal, written in the name of Enoch, attributed to him for the authority that attribution carries, but not actually written by him. This was a common and accepted literary practice in the ancient world, not a deception in the way we might understand it today. The writers of these texts were preserving and developing traditions they believed were genuinely ancient, even if they themselves were the ones setting them down in writing. When we read 1st Enoch, we are not reading the literal memoirs of a man who walked with God before the flood. We are reading the theological reflections of communities in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era, communities who used Enoch's name as a vessel for exploring the deepest questions about heaven, evil, and divine justice. That does not make the text less interesting or less important. It makes it a window into a very specific and very rich world of ancient religious thought. As we bring this chapter toward its close, I want to gather what we have established tonight because it forms the interpretive ground on which everything else in our story will rest. First, Enoch is old. The Book of Watchers section likely dates to the 3rd century before the Common Era. It was important, preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, canonical in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, quoted directly in the New Testament letter of Jude. It is attributed to the mysterious figure of Enoch from Genesis 5, but classified by scholars as pseudepigraphal, written in his name as a way of grounding its claims in ancient tradition. It is not in most of our Bibles, and that fact deserves honest acknowledgement. But its absence from our personal canon does not erase its presence in the ancient world, or its influence on the texts that are in our Bibles. When I read Jude's direct quotation of 1st Enoch, I feel the connections between these ancient traditions in a way that is hard to dismiss. Now I want to carry you toward what comes next, because we have spent time understanding the vessel, the text of 1st Enoch, its origins, its authority, its place in history. What we have not yet done is enter the story it tells. And the story begins with a dramatic, specific, she almost cinematically detailed account of what happened when the Watchers left their station and descended to earth. First Enoch chapter 6 tells us that 200 of them gathered, that they chose a specific place of descent, and that before they came down, they made an oath, bound themselves together in a covenant commitment to the action they were about to take. That moment of descent, that oath, that chosen mountain, it is where the real story of the Watchers begins, and it is where we are headed in our next chapter. Close your eyes for just a moment and picture a mountain, not a gentle, rolling hill, a mountain of genuine scale and presence. Mount Hermon rises to just over 9,000 feet, and it sits at the meeting point of what we know today as Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. In winter, its peak is covered with snow. On clear days, it can be seen from vast distances across the ancient landscape. It is one of the most prominent geographical features in the entire region, a landmark that ancient peoples would have known well, would have oriented themselves by, would have seen on the horizon from miles away. The ancient world did not look at mountains the way we do, as geological formations to be measured and climbed. Mountains were understood as places where the divine and the earthly drew close together. High places, the ancient writers called them, sacred peaks, thresholds between worlds. And it is on exactly this mountain, Mount Hermon, that the Book of First Enoch places the most consequential descent in all of angelic lore. First Enoch chapter 6 describes what happened with a clarity that is almost startling. The text tells us that 200 watchers, who were in the days of Jared, an ancient patriarch from Genesis 5, descended on Mount Hermon. They came down together, a company of 200, and the mountain itself is named in this text as the location of their arrival. What I find remarkable about this detail is the specificity of it. First, Enoch does not say somewhere in the ancient world. It says Mount Hermon. And Mount Hermon, while its exact religious associations in the earliest periods are not fully documented, does appear in the canonical Hebrew Bible in context connected to the edges of the Promised Land and to the northern boundary of Israelite territory. Judges chapter 3, verse 3, and 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 23 mention the mountain in geographic terms, and the association with Baal Hermon, a Baal worship site, suggests that this mountain carried sacred significance for multiple ancient peoples. Whether First Enoch's placement of the descent there reflects a genuine geographic tradition or a theological choice, we honestly cannot say with certainty, but the specificity itself is arresting. Now here is the detail from 1 Enoch chapter 6 that I keep returning to, because it reveals something profound about how the ancient writers understood this event. Before the 200 came down, their leader, whose name 1 Enoch records as Shemihaza, did not simply give the order and lead the descent. He spoke first to those gathered with him. He said something like, "I fear that you alone will not want to do this deed, and that I alone will be guilty of this great sin." In other words, Shemihaza was aware that what they were about to do was wrong. He knew it was a transgression, and his response to that knowledge was not to turn back. His response was to make the shared commitment binding, so that the guilt could not fall on anyone being alone. The 200 answered him with a plan. "Let us all swear an oath, and let us bind one another with curses, not to abandon this plan, but to carry it out." And so they swore. 1 Enoch chapter 6, verses 4 and 5 record this collective oath as the act that sealed their commitment before they ever set foot on the earth below. Think about what this means for a moment. The ancient text is not describing an accidental fall, a moment of weakness that overtook beings who did not realize the consequences. It is describing a deliberate, premeditated act carried out by beings who knew it was wrong, who made a binding covenant to do it anyway, and who descended together so that none could later claim innocence while the others bore the blame. The oath they swore took the form of a mutual curse, essentially a covenant, a berith in the ancient Near Eastern sense, where the parties bind themselves together under the threat of divine judgment if they break the commitment. The terrible irony is that they used the most solemn form of agreement available to them in order to ensure they would all commit together what they all knew they should not do. I find this detail both deeply sobering and remarkably psychologically honest. The ancient writers understood something true about how groups of powerful beings, or powerful people, can collectively choose destruction, and each one emboldened by the presence of the others. The Book of Jubilees, chapter 5, verse 1, also tells this story and frames the descent in ways that parallel 1st Enoch's account. Jubilees is another Second Temple Jewish text, not in the Protestant or Catholic canon, but widely read and important in that ancient period. It presents the descending beings as violating a clear divine order, stepping outside the boundary that had been set for them, breaching the distinction between the heavenly and the earthly in a way that had irreversible consequences. What I find important about having these two sources tell overlapping versions of the same story is that it shows us this was not a tradition isolated in one obscure text. The Watcher descent narrative was known across multiple communities and multiple literary traditions. It was part of a shared world of theological imagination that serious ancient readers inhabited. Now I want to address something honestly, because intellectual honesty requires it. The placement of the Watcher's descent on Mount Hermon is drawn from 1st Enoch chapter 6. It is not in any canonical biblical text. Genesis chapter 6 does not name a mountain. Daniel does not name a mountain. This geographical detail belongs entirely to the 1st Enoch tradition, and that means we hold it as pseudepigraphal tradition rather than canonical scripture. What the canonical text gives us is the act, the sons of God taking human wives, not the location or the oath or the names of those involved. First, Enoch fills in what Genesis leaves blank, and it does so with a vividness and specificity that feels like memory, so even when it is literary imagination. When we honor the label on this material, pseudepigraphal, not canonical, we can appreciate it for what it is, a profound ancient attempt to answer the questions that Genesis deliberately left open. What did it mean in the ancient world's theological imagination that this descent happened on a mountain? High places in the ancient Near East were understood as thresholds, locations where heaven and earth met, where the divine could communicate with the earthly. Israel's own tradition had its own sacred mountains. Sinai, where God spoke to Moses. Zion, where God's presence was associated with the temple. The great mountains of the surrounding cultures were similarly understood as meeting points between worlds. If you wanted to imagine where divine beings might cross over from their domain into the human world, a mountain was the natural threshold. And Hermon, tall, snow-capped, visible for miles, standing at the boundary of territories associated with ancient worship, was a fitting choice for the ancient writers to name as the place where two worlds collided in the most catastrophic way. Let me offer a moment of theological reflection here. The tradition we are sitting with tonight presents the Watcher descent, not simply as a moral failure, but as a category error of cosmic proportions. These beings were created for a specific existence, a specific domain, a specific function. They were watchers, observers, sentinels, members of the divine council, and they abandoned that function not for something better, but for something that blurred the distinction between kinds of beings that were meant to remain distinct. Ancient theology, whether Jewish or Mesopotamian or Canaanite, was deeply concerned with the proper ordering of categories: heaven and earth, divine and human, sacred and ordinary. When those boundaries were crossed wrongly, the result was chaos, corruption, and suffering. The Watcher descent in this framework is not just a sin, it is a disruption of the structure of reality itself. And the consequences, which first Enoch traces in painful detail, spread exactly as far as you would expect when a cornerstone is pulled from the foundation of the cosmic order. As we come toward the close of this chapter, I want to rest with the image of that mountain for a moment, that high, snow-touched peak at the meeting of borders, where 200 heavenly beings descended under mutual oath to do what they had already acknowledged was wrong. The Book of Jubilees and First Enoch together give us a tradition of remarkable psychological and theological depth. These were not mindless creatures acting on instinct. They were beings with awareness, with knowledge of right and wrong, with the capacity for covenant commitment. And they used all of those capacities in the service of a choice they knew would cost them everything. There is a tragedy in this picture that the ancient writers seem to have felt keenly. The fall of the Watchers is not a triumphant rebellion story. It is a story about the waste of something that was, before the oath and the descent, genuinely beautiful. And now here is where I want to carry you as we move into our next chapter. Because the descent was not the end of the story, it was only the beginning. Once the Watchers had come down, they did not simply live quietly among humanity. They began to teach. And what they taught, according to First Enoch, was knowledge that God had kept from human hands, the arts of metalworking and warfare, the secrets of cosmetics and enchantment, the mysteries of the stars. This transfer of forbidden knowledge, the gifting of capabilities that humanity was not meant to have, is one of the most theologically charged aspects of the entire Watcher tradition. It is the subject of our next chapter, and it is a part of this ancient story that touches questions we still ask today about knowledge, power, and the difference between what we are capable of and what we should choose to do. There is a question that runs through almost every ancient culture, in one form or another. Where did human evil come from? Not just the ordinary failures of ordinary people, but the deep structural capacity for violence, for manipulation, for the organized destruction of other human beings. The ancient Israelites and the communities who preserved First Enoch had a very specific answer to that question, and it is one of the most striking ideas in all of ancient religious literature. The answer they gave was this: certain knowledge was never meant to be in human hands. There were things humanity did not know, could not do, would not have pursued, not because humans were perfectly innocent, but because the tools and techniques for certain kinds of destruction had not yet been discovered. And then the Watchers came down, and everything changed. Tonight, I want to sit with you in that ancient claim and look at it carefully. What the texts actually say the Watchers taught, why it mattered, and what the tradition believed the consequences were. I think you will find it more specific, more detailed, and more thoughtful than you might expect. First Enoch chapter 7, verse 1, and then chapter 8, verses 1 through 4. Give us the most detailed account we have of the Watchers' teaching. And I want to be clear with you from the beginning. This is First Enoch, not the canonical Bible. This is pseudepigraphal tradition, ancient, serious, enormously influential, but not canonical scripture in the Protestant or Catholic sense. What the text offers us is a list, and it is a remarkably organized list. The Watchers did not simply teach one forbidden thing. They taught across multiple domains: the arts of war, the arts of the body, and the arts of what we might call hidden knowledge. First, Enoch chapter 7 describes the teaching of how to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. The Watcher tradition understood the origin of organized warfare, not as a natural human discovery, but as a gift from beings who should never have given it. Think about what that means as a theological claim. It says that the capacity for organized, systematic violence was not something humanity arrived at independently. It was taught. The text then names specific teachers and specific subjects. First, Enoch, chapter 8, verse 1, centers on a figure named Azazel. We will encounter Azazel again in a later chapter in a very surprising context inside the canonical book of Leviticus. But here in First Enoch, Azazel is identified as the one who taught human beings the art of metalworking. Specifically, the text says he taught men to make swords and the instruments of war from metal, and he taught women the art of cosmetics, the making of ornaments, the use of eye pigments and dyes, the adornment of the human body in ways meant to attract and deceive. Now, when I first encountered this detail about cosmetics sitting alongside warfare, I thought it seemed oddly placed. But the more I sat with it, the more I understood what the text is doing. It is grouping these teachings under the same moral category. The art of making a sword and the art of painting the face are being described as parallel acts. Both are technologies of desire, manipulation, and destruction. Both were, in the tradition's view, brought into the world by the same transgression. First, Enoch chapter 8, verse 3, then lists additional teachings attributed to another leader, Semyaz and his associates. This section describes the teaching of enchantments, of root cutting, which likely refers to the preparation of herbal remedies and poisons, and of astrology, the reading of the stars for knowledge that was considered hidden. In the ancient world, knowledge of the stars was not simply scientific observation. It was a claim to access information about fate, about the future, about the hidden workings of the cosmos. The tradition is saying that the Watchers handed humanity a set of tools for claiming a kind of cosmic knowledge and cosmic power that was not meant to be in human hands. The scholar Annette Yoshiko Reed, in her 2005 Cambridge University Press book Fallen Angels and the History of Judaism and Christianity, makes the insightful point that this framework served a specific theological purpose for Second Temple Jewish communities. It gave them a way to explain the existence of evil arts, warfare, sorcery, vanity, divination, without attributing their invention to God or to human nature alone. The blame was placed on the transgressing Watchers. Here is something that I find genuinely thought-provoking about this list of forbidden teachings. The Watchers did not teach abstract philosophical evil. They did not simply corrupt human thinking. They gave humanity practical tools, techniques, crafts, arts that could be used immediately to cause harm. Metalworking for weapons, cosmetics for seduction and deception, enchantments for controlling others, astrology for claiming hidden knowledge. Each of these is a technology of power, a way of gaining advantage over other people, of bending the world to one's will, of reaching beyond what was given. And the tradition's claim is that before these teachings arrived, humanity did not have them. There is a parallel here that even a casual reader will notice. The knowledge of good and evil acquired through the forbidden fruit in Genesis chapter 3. The fire stolen from the gods in the Greek myth of Prometheus. The forbidden wisdom accessed through transgression in Mesopotamian tales. The ancient world returned again and again to this same intuition, that certain knowledge changes everything, and not always for the better. 1 Enoch chapter 9, verses 6 through 8, then shows us the consequence of all this teaching. The text describes the archangels, Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel, looking down from heaven and seeing the earth. What they see is devastation. The ground is filled with blood. Humanity is being crushed under the weight of the violence and corruption that the Watcher's teachings have unleashed. The archangels bring this report before God, and in their report they explicitly connect the suffering below to the knowledge above. The Watchers taught these things, and these things produced this destruction. The causal chain is clear in the text. Forbidden knowledge, once given, could not be taken back. The archangels do not simply report that the Watchers sinned. They report that the earth is calling out under the weight of what that sin produced. There is an ecological dimension to this picture that I find remarkable. The ground itself is described as suffering. The violence unleashed by forbidden knowledge has saturated the earth. Now I want to spend a moment with the Greek myth of Prometheus, because the parallel is real and worth naming honestly. In Greek tradition, Prometheus was a titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. Fire representing both warmth and survival, and the capacity for technology and craft. The gods punished him for this transgression by chaining him to a rock. The parallel with the Watcher tradition is striking. A divine or semi-divine being transgresses a cosmic boundary, gives humanity something powerful that the gods did not intend for them to have, and suffers severe consequences as a result. The scholar Annette Yoshiko Reed notes this comparative dimension, and it is worth taking seriously as evidence that these ancient traditions were grappling with genuinely shared human questions. This does not mean 1st Enoch borrowed from Prometheus, or that Greek mythology influenced the Watcher tradition directly. What it means is that the question of forbidden knowledge and its consequences was a question that many ancient cultures felt with equal force, and that they answered with structurally similar stories. From a theological standpoint, what the Watcher teaching tradition offers is a specific and sobering account of how evil becomes embedded in the structures of society, rather than remaining merely personal. This is not just a story about individual Watchers sinning individually. It is a story about knowledge spreading, multiplying, becoming available to everyone, generation after generation. Once you know how to make a sword, you cannot unknow it. Once the art of metalworking for weapons is in the world, it does not stay in the hands of those who first learned it. The tradition seems to understand this deeply. The evil that the Watchers introduced was not contained. It metastasized. 1 Enoch chapter 9's description of the archangels watching the destruction below captures exactly this quality. The original sin was the Watcher's descent and transgression, but the consequence, the suffering the archangels witness, belongs to all of humanity who received the dangerous gift and could not refuse it once it was offered. As we gather the threads of this chapter, I want to hold two things together in honest tension. First, this tradition, while extra-biblical, is theologically serious and historically significant. It shaped how early Jewish and Christian communities understood the origin of systemic evil, warfare, sorcery, manipulation, in ways that left real marks on the New Testament's own language. Second, we must be careful not to let the vividness of 1st Enoch's account bleed into our reading of the canonical scriptures. The canonical Bible does not tell us that Azazel taught metallurgy. The canonical Bible does not give us Simyah's teaching enchantments. Those details belong to 1st Enoch, clearly labeled pseudepigraphal, and they deserve to be honored for what they are. a profound ancient tradition, without being passed off as biblical fact. The line between canonical and extra-canonical matters, and I want to keep drawing it clearly for you, even as we walk through this extraordinary material. What we have explored tonight brings us to the darkest and most disturbing consequence of the Watcher's presence on earth. The forbidden knowledge was one terrible gift, but the Watchers brought something else into the world as well. Or rather, the union of heavenly beings with human women produced something the world had never seen before and was never equipped to handle. 1 Enoch chapter 7 describes the offspring of those unions in terms that still unsettle careful readers thousands of years later. These were the Nephilim, the giants, the mighty ones, the beings who consumed everything the earth could offer and then began consuming the earth itself. Their story is the next chapter of our journey, and it is one of the strangest, most debated, and most persistently fascinating parts of this entire tradition. We will look at it honestly, carefully, and with full attention to what the texts actually say, both canonical and extra-canonical, about who and what the Nephilim were. There is a word in the Hebrew Bible that has fascinated, troubled, and haunted readers for thousands of years. The word appears in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, and it appears again centuries later in Numbers chapter 13, verse 33. The word is Nephilim. In most of our English Bibles, you will find it either transliterated exactly, just the Hebrew word carried over into English letters, or translated as giants. And that single translation choice, that one word, has generated more misunderstanding, more wild speculation, and more outright misinformation than perhaps any other word in the entire Old Testament. Tonight, I want to sit with you and look at what the texts actually say about the Nephilim, the canonical texts, the extra-canonical traditions, and the scholarly work that tries to hold all of it together honestly. I am not going to sensationalize this, but I am also not going to minimize it, because what the ancient sources describe is genuinely extraordinary and deserves our full, careful attention. Let us begin with the Hebrew word itself. Nephilim, Enpilium, comes from a root whose exact meaning is honestly contested among scholars who have studied it for careers. One reading connects it to the Hebrew verb naphal, meaning to fall, which would make Nephilim something like the fallen ones. A reading that fits neatly with the idea that they descended from watchers who fell from their heavenly station. Another reading suggests a root meaning connected to something like extraordinary ones or overwhelming ones, beings of unusual power and presence. The ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, chose to render Nephilim as gigantes, which gives us our English word giants. And that translation decision has shaped the popular imagination ever since. When you read the old King James Bible and encounter giants in these passages, you are reading a translation that goes back through the Greek all the way to a specific interpretive choice made by ancient translators. The Hebrew word itself does not settle the question, it leaves it open. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, gives us the canonical text's entire description of the Nephilim, and I want you to notice how brief it is. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. That is the whole description. Mighty men, men of renown. The ancient writer is not describing enormous monsters here in explicit language. He is describing legendary figures, warrior heroes of the kind that ancient Near Eastern cultures celebrated in their own traditions. The scholar John Walton a careful and respected Old Testament scholar at Wheaton College, argues in his 2018 IVP academic book, The Lost World of the Flood, that the Nephilim are best understood as a class of violent tyrant warriors, powerful, domineering, legendary in their capacity for destruction, rather than as literal supernatural giants. That is a scholarly position worth taking seriously, because it stays close to what the canonical text actually says. Now, Numbers chapter 13 brings the Nephilim back at a moment of great drama, and it does so in a way that has puzzled careful readers ever since. Moses sends 12 spies into the land of Canaan to scout it before the Israelites attempt to enter. 10 of those spies come back with what the text calls a bad report. They tell the assembled people, "We saw the Nephilim there, the sons of Anak who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." This is the full extent of the canonical reference. The spies were terrified. They reached for the most frightening name they knew, Nephilim, to describe the inhabitants who overwhelmed them with fear. What strikes me about this passage is the context. These spies were giving a fearful report designed to discourage the people from going forward. They were arguing against the mission, and they reached for hyperbole. They said they felt like grasshoppers by comparison. This does not mean the Nephilim reference is false, but it does mean we should weigh the context carefully. Fear has a way of making things larger than they are. The question that immediately arises from Numbers chapter 13 is the one that should be obvious to any attentive reader. The Nephilim were supposed to have perished in the flood. Genesis chapters 6 through 9 describe a global inundation that was meant, in the narrative's own terms, to cleanse the earth of the corruption and violence the Nephilim had helped produce. So how are there Nephilim in Canaan centuries later? Various answers have been offered across the tradition. Some ancient interpreters suggested that the flood was not global in the way a literal reading suggests. Some proposed that not all the Nephilim were killed. Some suggested that the Watcher Transgression happened again after the flood. Genesis 6, verse 4, does include the phrase, "and also afterward," which may be exactly this ambiguity baked into the text. The Anakites of Canaan, including the later figure of Og of Bashan, whose enormous iron bed is described in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 11, were connected by later Jewish tradition to this Nephilim lineage. But I want to be clear, these connections are traditional interpretation, not explicit canonical statements. Here is where 1st Enoch enters, with a dramatically different and far more extreme portrait. 1st Enoch chapter 7, verses 2 through 5, describes the Nephilim in terms that go far beyond anything the canonical text says. The text tells us these hybrid offspring grew to enormous sizes. The numbers given in ancient manuscripts vary but are extraordinarily large, and that they consumed everything the earth produced. When the food of the earth ran out, they turned to the animals. When the animals were not enough, they began to consume human beings. And when that was not enough, they began to drink blood. This is a picture of absolute, unrestrained consumption and violence, being so vast in their appetites and so destructive in their nature that the very earth could not sustain them. The ancient Septuagint translation rendered Nephilim as gigantes, and 1st Enoch's account fleshes out exactly the kind of beings that word implies, not just tall, but cosmically destructive, a living wound in the fabric of creation. I want to be transparent with you about something that comes up whenever this topic is discussed outside careful scholarship. There are persistent claims circulating in popular culture, on websites, in sensationalized documentaries, in certain corners of the internet, that giant human skeletons have been discovered and suppressed by governments or scientific institutions. I want to say this plainly and honestly. These claims have been thoroughly investigated and consistently debunked by archaeologists and physical anthropologists. No verified discovery of abnormally large human skeletal remains that would confirm a race of literal giants has ever been authenticated by mainstream archaeology. The photographs that circulate online have been traced to digital manipulation, misidentified animal bones, or simply fabricated stories. Responsible engagement with the Nephilim tradition requires us to distinguish between what the ancient texts claim, what theology and interpretation have built on those claims, and what the physical evidence of archaeology actually shows. The tradition is fascinating and worth exploring on its own terms. It does not need false evidence to be significant. Now let me turn to the theological dimension of the Nephilim story, because I think it carries something worth sitting with quietly. Whatever the Nephilim were, supernatural hybrids, legendary warrior tyrants, symbols of systemic violence, or some combination of all three, their presence in the tradition functions as a picture of what happens when boundaries are crossed that were never meant to be crossed. The union of watchers and human women produced something that did not fit the ordered categories of creation. The Nephilim were neither fully heavenly nor fully human. They were, in the tradition's own language, something that did not belong, beings whose existence was itself a distortion of the created order. And the consequence of that distortion was violence on a cosmic scale. First Enoch, chapter 9, with its description of the archangels watching the blood-soaked earth, captures the outcome. Not just individual wrongdoing, but a world so saturated with destruction that the ground itself seemed to cry out. The Nephilim story is, at its heart, a story about what unlimited power without accountability or restraint does to the world. As we draw toward the end of this chapter, I want to hold together, honestly, the two strands of the Nephilim tradition. The canonical strand, Genesis 6 and Numbers 13, gives us a brief, evocative, deliberately incomplete portrait. Mighty men, men of renown, a word whose etymology the text does not explain, a reference that appears centuries after the flood without explanation. The extra-canonical strand, First Enoch's vivid, disturbing account of monstrous hybrid offspring consuming the world, gives us a dramatically expanded picture that has shaped the popular imagination far more than most people realize. Both strands are worth knowing. Both deserve their proper label, and neither should be confused with the other. The canonical Bible is sparse on the Nephilim for reasons that probably have as much to do with the ancient writer's theological priorities as with anything else. The tradition preserved in First Enoch filled in those gaps with its own particular theological concerns. Both are telling us something true about the ancient world's sense of what had gone wrong, even if the specific details differ significantly. Now, we are ready to follow what came next, because the Nephilim and the spreading destruction they brought were not the end of the story. The archangels, watching from above, brought their report to God, and God responded, not with immediate destruction, but with something more structured, more deliberate, more specific. He dispatched 4 archangels with individual assignments, and each one charged with a particular aspect of the response to what the Watchers had done. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, 4 names that appear across canonical and extra-canonical texts alike, received orders that were as precise and weighty as anything described in ancient angelic lore. That moment of divine response, that commissioning of the archangels, is exactly where we are headed next. And I think you will find that the assignments they received reveal something remarkable about how the ancient world understood divine justice. not as a blunt instrument, but as a precise and purposeful response to specific transgressions. There is something quietly powerful about the moment when justice is finally set in motion, not the loud, immediate kind of justice, the kind that arrives before anyone has even finished the harmful act, but the measured kind, the deliberate kind, the kind that comes after witnesses have gathered all the evidence, after every cry has been heard, after the full weight of what has happened has been acknowledged and understood. That is the kind of moment we find ourselves in tonight. The Watchers have descended. They have taught forbidden knowledge. Their offspring have ravaged the earth. The ground is saturated with blood. And now, in the ancient narrative preserved in 1st Enoch, something turns. The archangels, 4 of them, named and specific, each with a clearly defined assignment, are dispatched. I want to walk with you through this moment carefully, because it is one of the most detailed and theologically rich depictions of angelic function in all of ancient religious literature. And parts of it, as we will see, reach directly into the canonical scriptures you may know well. Let us start with 1st Enoch chapter 9, verses 1 through 11, because this is where the archangels enter the story, not as passive observers, but as active participants. The text names 4 archangels: Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel. These 4, the text says, looked down from above and saw what was happening on the earth. They saw the blood being shed. They heard the crying of the earth. And they brought all of it before God. Every detail of what the Watchers had done, the teaching of forbidden arts, the destruction of the Nephilim, the suffering of humanity. This is a remarkable image. 4 of the most powerful beings in the heavenly court, functioning in this moment as what we might call witnesses, gathering the full account of what has happened and presenting it before the divine throne so that judgment can proceed with complete knowledge of the facts. The ancient text is not describing a God who is unaware of what happened on earth. It is describing a cosmic legal process, a divine court receiving the full testimony before issuing its verdict. Now here is where the canonical scriptures enter this story in a way that matters. Michael appears in the canonical Bible in ways that confirm his status as the chief angelic warrior and defender of God's people. Daniel chapter 10, verses 13 and 21. Names Michael as one of the chief princes who comes to the aid of the divine messenger sent to Daniel, and as your prince, the angelic guardian of Israel. Daniel chapter 12, verse 1 calls him the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. Revelation chapter 12, verse 7 describes Michael leading the angelic armies in war against the dragon. So when 1st Enoch names Michael as one of the 4 archangels charged with responding to the Watcher crisis, it is not inventing a figure from nothing. It is drawing on a tradition of Michael as the foremost angelic warrior, the one who, when heaven needs a champion in the cosmic conflict, is the first one called. Gabriel is perhaps the most familiar of the 4 archangels to most readers, because he appears by name in the canonical New Testament as the messenger who announces to Mary that she will bear the Son of God. In Luke chapter 1. In the Old Testament, Gabriel appears in Daniel chapters 8 and 9 as the divine messenger who interprets visions for Daniel. His role across these canonical texts is fundamentally communicative. He carries messages of divine revelation and interpretation. In 1st Enoch's response to the Watcher crisis, Gabriel receives a specific assignment connected to the Nephilim. He is sent to deal with their destruction, the consequence of the transgression that produced them. I want to be careful and honest here. The specific details of Gabriel's Enochic assignment go beyond what the canonical scriptures describe, and they carry their pseudepigraphal label. But the character of Gabriel, the angel of divine message and revelation, is consistent across both traditions. Raphael is where things become particularly interesting for readers of the biblical Apocrypha. In the deuterocanonical Book of Tobit, chapter 12, verse 15, a figure who has been traveling with the young Tobias all along reveals his identity. I am Raphael, one of the 7 holy angels who present the prayers of the saints and who go in and out before the glory of the Holy One. This is the only canonical or deuterocanonical naming of Raphael, and it places him among the highest tier of heavenly beings, not just a messenger angel, but one who stands permanently before God's presence. The scholar Daryl Hannah, in his 1999 Moore Seebeck work, Michael and Christ, traces how these named archangels developed their distinct identities and functions across the literature of the Second Temple period. In 1 Enoch chapter 10, verses 4 through 6, Raphael receives one of the most specific and weighty assignments of the entire angelic response. He is sent to bind Azazel, the watcher leader responsible for the most destructive of the forbidden teachings, hand and foot, and to cast him into a place of darkness in the desert, a location the text calls Dudael. This moment of Raphael binding Azazel and casting him into darkness is one of the most vivid scenes in the entire Enochic narrative. The text says he is to cover Azazel's face so that he cannot see the light, and to leave him there until the day of judgment. Think about the precision of this response. The being who taught the arts of warfare and weapon making, who gave humanity the tools for organized destruction, is himself bound, immobilized, covered in darkness, stripped of power and sight. There is a kind of poetic justice in this that the ancient writers seem to have appreciated. The one who empowered others to bind and harm is himself bound. The one who brought deadly knowledge into the light of the human world is himself placed in permanent darkness. The location, Dudael, has not been identified with any certainty in the historical or geographical record. It may be symbolic, a literary device for a desert wilderness at the edge of the inhabited world. Whatever its nature, the image is powerful. A once mighty watcher, now utterly stripped of agency, waiting in the dark. And then there is Uriel, the 4th archangel named in 1 Enoch chapter 9. Uriel's assignment in chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, is striking, because it connects the archangelic response directly to the Great Flood. Uriel is sent to Noah, not to instruct him about the watchers per se, but to warn him about the coming destruction so that he can survive it and preserve life through it. Uriel, in this telling, is the divine messenger who carries the warning that gives the flood story its redemptive dimension. The earth will be cleansed, but something, someone, will be saved through it. What I find meaningful about Uriel's role here is that it shows the archangelic response to the Watcher crisis was not simply punitive. Yes, Azazel is bound. Yes, Shemihaza and the other Watchers are dealt with. But alongside the judgment, there is a provision for survival. The response to catastrophe includes, from the very beginning, a plan for what comes after it. From a theological standpoint, I want to reflect on what this picture of 4 archangels receiving specific assignments tells us about how ancient writers understood divine justice. It is not impulsive or random. Each transgression receives a targeted response. Azazel, who taught specific forbidden arts, is assigned a specific punisher and a specific fate. Shemihaza, who organized and led the collective descent, receives a different treatment from Michael in 1 Enoch chapter 10, verses 11 through 14. The Nephilim spirits are addressed by Gabriel. The human survivors are protected through Uriel's warning to Noah. The precision of this response reflects a theology of cosmic order being carefully restored, not just destroyed and rebuilt, but deliberately, specifically repaired at each point where it was broken. This resonates with the canonical portrayal of God's justice as careful and discriminating, punishing specific sin, protecting the innocent, restoring what was disrupted. Now, I want to acknowledge something clearly, because intellectual honesty requires it at this point. The named archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, occupy different levels of canonical recognition. Michael and Gabriel appear by name in the canonical Old and New Testaments. Raphael appears by name in the deuterocanonical Book of Tobit, accepted in Catholic and Orthodox traditions. Uriel does not appear by name in any canonical or deuterocanonical text. His name presence is found only in 1st Enoch and other pseudo-epigraphal literature. So when we describe these four archangels as a commission, we are drawing on material that ranges from canonical through deuterocanonical to pseudo-epigraphal. Different readers within different traditions will weight these sources differently, and that is entirely appropriate. What we can say with confidence is that the tradition of named archangels with specific cosmic functions was deeply embedded in Second Temple Jewish and early Christian thought, and that the canonical scriptures themselves support the existence of a named archangel hierarchy, even if they do not fill in all the details. As we bring this chapter to a close, I want to let the image of those four archangels rest in your mind. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, each one given a specific task, dispatched with divine authority to restore something that had been catastrophically broken. The ancient tradition preserves in this moment a picture of divine response that is neither panic nor indifference. The earth is crying. The blood of the innocent is rising. The Watcher's forbidden knowledge has spread its destruction through the human world, and the response that comes from the divine throne is measured, purposeful, and complete. Each wound is addressed. Each transgressor is dealt with. Each survivor is provided for. In the next chapter, we will follow exactly what happened when those orders were carried out. The binding, the imprisonment, the sealing away of the fallen watchers in the depths of the earth, where they await a judgment still to come. It is a picture of divine justice that is, in its own quiet way, both sobering and strangely consoling. There is something about the idea of being bound that speaks to the deep instincts of ancient storytelling. Not killed, not erased, bound, imprisoned, placed in a condition of total immobility, total powerlessness, held in that state not for a fixed term of years, but until a day that has not yet arrived. This is what happened to the Watchers, according to both 1st Enoch and, remarkably, the canonical New Testament. Tonight, we are going to follow the story of what the archangels actually did after they received their orders. And we are going to discover that this part of the tradition is not confined to extra-biblical literature. It pressed its way directly into the letters of Peter and the letter of Jude, into the canonical scriptures themselves, in language that has puzzled and fascinated careful readers for 2,000 years. I want to take you through that language tonight with real care, because I think once you see what Peter and Jude are actually referring to, these passages will never read the same way to you again. Let us begin with 1st Enoch chapter 10, verses 11 through 14, because this is where the imprisonment of the Watcher leader Shemihaza is specifically described. Michael receives the assignment: bind Shemihaza and his associates, the text says, in the valleys of the earth. Specifically, the text speaks of binding them beneath the hills of the earth, pressing them face downward into the ground, piling rocks over them. They are to remain there for 70 generations, bound, immobilized, buried until the great day of judgment, when they will be led away to a final accounting and to what the text calls the consummation. The number 70 generations is, of course, a symbolic number in biblical literature. It does not give us a calendar date. What it gives us is a sense of duration, vast, open-ended, spanning from the antediluvian world all the way to the final judgment at the end of history. The watchers are not merely punished and released. They are held in suspended sentence, awaiting a day of reckoning that 1 Enoch chapter 16, verse 1 confirms will come at the Great Judgment. Now let me bring you to the New Testament, because this is where the story becomes unmistakably canonical. Open the letter of Jude, that short, single-chapter letter near the very end of the Bible. Verse 6 says these words, "And the angels, who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day." Read that again, slowly. Angels who did not keep their own domain, who abandoned their proper dwelling. These are kept in eternal bonds, under darkness, for the judgment of the great day. Every single element of that verse corresponds to what 1 Enoch describes. The watchers who abandoned their proper station, who came down from their heavenly domain, who are now bound and imprisoned in darkness, waiting for a final judgment. Jude is not giving us new information here that he invented. He is drawing on a tradition his readers clearly already knew, the same tradition we have been following through 1 Enoch. And here, in the canonical New Testament, it carries the weight of inspired scripture. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4 takes us even deeper into something remarkable. Peter writes, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus and committed them to pits of gloomy darkness, to be kept until the judgment." The word that strikes me every time I read this in the original Greek is tartaroses, which the translators render as cast into Tartarus or cast into hell, depending on which Bible you are reading. This is the only place in the entire New Testament, the only place in the entire Bible where the word Tartarus appears. Every reader who knows Greek literature immediately recognizes it. Tartarus is the deepest pit of the underworld in Greek cosmology, the place beneath Hades itself, where the most terrible beings were imprisoned. It is a word borrowed from outside the Hebrew tradition entirely, from the Greek cosmological imagination. And Peter uses it here deliberately to describe what happened to the sinning angels. He reaches across cultural boundaries to find the word that best captures the depth and totality of this imprisonment. The Thomas Schreiner commentary on 1st and 2nd Peter and Jude in the New American Commentary series, published in 2003, engages carefully with this passage and confirms that Peter's language here is almost certainly drawing on the same watcher tradition we find in 1 Enoch. Think about the theological weight of this for a moment. Peter is not writing mythology for its own sake. He is making a theological argument. If God did not spare even powerful heavenly beings when they sinned, if even they were bound in the deepest darkness to await judgment, then the certainty of divine accountability applies to all moral agents everywhere. This is not primarily a story about angels. Peter is using the watcher imprisonment as evidence for the dependability of divine justice. What happened to the watchers is, in Peter's argument, a guarantee that God's justice is real, thorough, and inescapable. The imprisonment of the watchers is not a footnote in an obscure mythology. It is a theological foundation stone in Peter's case for the integrity of divine judgment. I want to pause on the location that 1 Enoch assigns to Azazel's imprisonment specifically, the place the text calls Dudael. 1 Enoch chapter 10, For verses 4 and 5 describe Raphael casting Azazel into a rough and jagged place in the desert, covering him with rocks, leaving him in darkness at a location that has not been successfully identified with any known geographical site. Most scholars who work on First Enoch treat Dudael as likely a literary or symbolic location, rather than an actual identifiable place. A wilderness at the edge of the world, away from human habitation, beyond the boundary of the ordered earth. What strikes me about this is how the punishment fits the crime in a specific way. Azazel, who taught human beings the arts of making beautiful weapons and adorning the body for seduction, who traded in beauty and craftsmanship and the appeal of visible things, is buried in the dark, face covered, unable to see anything at all. The one who gave sight into forbidden things is made blind to everything. The cosmological picture embedded in these descriptions of imprisonment is worth understanding in its historical context. The ancient world, Hebrew, Mesopotamian, Greek, and others, shared a broad understanding of a layered cosmos in which the underworld was a real, populated place beneath the earth, where the dead and the bound existed in diminished states. Mesopotamian texts describe the underworld as the land of Kur or Irkala, a place of darkness and dust beneath the living world. Greek cosmology placed Tartarus at the absolute bottom of this structure. First Enoch's description of the Watchers imprisoned in the valleys and beneath the hills of the earth draws on this same cosmological framework. The idea that below the surface of the living world lies a place of confinement, a prison built into the very structure of creation. Peter's use of the word Tartarus shows how fluidly ancient writers moved between these cultural frameworks when it served their theological purposes. The point was not the specific geography, but the reality of divine confinement and inescapable accountability. Here is something I find genuinely moving about the way this imprisonment is described. These were not beings who were destroyed, not beings who ceased to exist. They remain. They are conscious, apparently. They are waiting. The New Testament language, eternal bonds, gloomy darkness, kept until the judgment, suggests a condition of sustained but suspended existence, bound but not annihilated, alive but without power or freedom or light. There is something in that picture that the ancient writers seem to have regarded as a more complete form of justice than simple destruction. Destruction ends the story quickly. Imprisonment under sustained darkness, awaiting a judgment that will finally resolve everything. That is a different kind of accountability. It says, what you did has permanent consequences. The accounting is not finished. The day of reckoning is coming, and until it does, you wait. You remember what you chose. You bear the weight of what you set in motion. Let me acknowledge, as I have tried to do throughout our exploration, the honest limits of what we know. Jude 6 and 2 Peter 2. To verse 4 are canonical texts. They are in the New Testament, and they clearly draw on the Watcher imprisonment tradition. But they do not name Shemihaza or Azazel. They do not cite First Enoch by name. They do not describe Dudael or the specific details of the binding. They confirm the tradition, the imprisonment of sinning angels awaiting judgment, without endorsing every detail of First Enoch's account. This is exactly the kind of careful distinction that matters when we are reading across canonical and extra-canonical sources. The canonical texts validate the existence and significance of the tradition, without requiring us to treat every element of First Enoch as equally authoritative. Both pieces of the picture are real. Both deserve their proper label. As we bring this chapter to a close, Let the picture settle quietly in your mind. Beneath the hills of the earth, in a darkness that does not lift, in bonds that do not break, the watchers are held, not forever, but until a day. And above them, on the surface of the earth they fell to, the consequences of what they did are still unfolding, because the watchers themselves were imprisoned, but their offspring, the Nephilim, did not simply disappear when they died in the flood. According to 1st Enoch, something of them persisted. Their physical bodies perished in the water and the ruin of the antediluvian world. But the tradition held that their spirits did not go where ordinary human spirits go. They stayed, they lingered. And what they became in their lingering is the subject of our next chapter. And it is, according to 1st Enoch, the origin of something the New Testament speaks about constantly, something that touches every page of the Gospels. We are talking about the origin of demons, and the ancient answer to where they came from is stranger and more specific than most people have ever heard. There is a question that runs quietly through the entire New Testament, so consistently present that it is easy to stop noticing it. Jesus casts out demons. The Gospels describe him encountering unclean spirits repeatedly, in synagogues, on roadsides, in the tombs outside cities. The disciples are sent out with authority over unclean spirits. Paul writes about spiritual forces of evil. The entire New Testament operates within a world that takes the existence of malevolent spiritual beings entirely for granted. But here is the question I want to sit with you on tonight. Where did those beings come from? Not angels. Angels are a different category, holy beings created for a specific purpose. Not the fallen watchers either. Those are bound in the earth, awaiting judgment. So who or what are the demons that fill the pages of the Gospels? The canonical Bible does not give us a direct, systematic answer to that question, but the tradition preserved in 1st Enoch does, and it is one of the most specific and theologically surprising answers in all of ancient religious literature. 1st Enoch chapters 15 and 16 contain the passage I want to take you through tonight. This is the passage where the ancient writer addresses directly what happened to the Nephilim after they died. The physical bodies of the Nephilim perished, whether in the violence they themselves caused, in the wars they fought with one another, or ultimately in the waters of the flood that God sent to cleanse the earth. Their bodies were gone. But 1st Enoch chapter 15, verses 8 and 9, make a claim that the ancient writer presents with absolute conviction. The spirits of the Nephilim, because of their hybrid nature, born of heavenly watchers and earthly women, could not go where ordinary human spirits go. They were neither fully of the earth nor fully of the heaven. They did not belong to either domain, and because of that, they remained on the earth as bodiless spirits, looking for flesh to inhabit, looking for people to affect, looking for ways to continue the only existence they knew, an existence of appetite and domination and destruction. 1st Enoch chapter 15, verses 10 and 11, then describes what these spirits actually do in their disembodied state. They are called evil spirits in the text, and their activities are listed with a specificity that I find remarkable. They afflict, they oppress, they attack, they fight, they produce suffering. They do these things on the earth among human beings, because the earth is the domain they were born into. They cannot return to the heavens from which their fathers came. They cannot rest in the ordinary place of the dead. They are, in the tradition's own language, neither of heaven nor of earth, and so they haunt the boundary, looking for what they can no longer have: bodies, substance, the warmth of physical existence. First Enoch chapter 16 verse 1 sets a time limit on this activity. They will continue in this state until what the text calls the day of consummation, the great judgment. Their active existence as disembodied afflicting spirits is bounded by the same eschatological horizon that bounds the imprisonment of the watchers themselves. The Book of Jubilees, another important Second Temple Jewish text, chapter 10, verses 1 through 6, carries this tradition forward with a detail that is both fascinating and sobering. After the flood, Noah prays against these spirits. His children have suffered under their influence, and Noah brings his prayer before God, asking for their complete binding and removal. God listens. He orders the angels to bind all of the evil spirits in the place of judgment. But then a figure called Mastema, a name that functions in Jubilees similarly to how Satan functions elsewhere, makes a specific petition. He asks God to leave a portion of the spirits free so that they can continue to carry out his will and test humanity on the earth. And God, in the Jubilees account, agrees to leave 1/10 of the spirits free while binding the other 9/10. I want to be completely honest with you. This is Jubilees, a pseudepigraphal text, not canonical scripture. But the tradition it preserves here is remarkable because it acknowledges that the presence of these spirits in the world after the flood is not a sign that God's response to the Watcher crisis was incomplete. It is presented, instead, as a deliberate and bounded allowance, a provision within divine governance. Now here is the connection I want to draw carefully and honestly, because it touches canonical scripture. The scholar Clinton Arnold, in his 1992 IVP book, Powers of Darkness, argues that the New Testament's language about unclean spirits and demonic forces cannot be fully understood without accounting for the Second Temple Jewish framework that shaped the world Jesus and his disciples inhabited. When a first-century Jewish reader heard about Jesus casting out unclean spirits, they were not hearing about abstract evil forces. They were hearing within a theological context where the tradition we have been exploring tonight was live and known and widely shared. The language of unclean spirits, of oppression, of beings that afflict and torment without rest. This is exactly the language of First Enoch's account of the Nephilim spirits. Arnold does not argue that Jesus was endorsing First Enoch's specific claims as scripture. He argues that Jesus was operating within a world where these ideas shaped the questions people brought to him, the fears they carried, the categories they used to understand the suffering they experienced. What I find deeply important here is a distinction I want to make clearly, because it can easily be blurred. The canonical Bible does not state that demons are the disembodied spirits of dead Nephilim. That identification is not found in Genesis, in the Psalms, in the prophets, in the Gospels, in Paul's letters, or in Revelation. The canonical scriptures acknowledge the existence of unclean spirits and demons. They describe Jesus' authority over them, and they locate them within a broader framework of spiritual warfare. But they do not give us a systematic explanation of their origin. That explanation, the specific claim that demons are the spirits of dead Nephilim hybrid offspring, comes from First Enoch and is amplified in Jubilees. It is extra-canonical material, pseudepigraphal tradition, that filled in a gap the canonical scriptures deliberately or incidentally left open. Knowing this tradition enriches our reading of the canonical texts. Confusing it for canonical fact distorts them. Let me offer a moment of personal reflection here, because I think this is a place where the material invites it. What moves me about the ancient writer's answer to the question of where demons came from is the underlying logic of it. If you take the premise seriously, that watchers mated with human women and produced hybrid offspring who were neither fully of heaven nor fully of earth. Then the question of what happens to those spirits when they die becomes a genuine theological puzzle. The normal categories do not apply to them. They are anomalies in the created order, just as their birth was an anomaly. And the answer the ancient tradition gave to this puzzle was, in its own way, internally consistent. Beings that were never fully of either world cannot go to either world when their bodies are gone. They remain in a condition of displacement, of homelessness, seeking what they can never fully have. There is a melancholy in that picture that I do not think was unintentional. The tradition is not celebrating these spirits. It is describing them as the ongoing collateral damage of the original Watcher transgression. Here is what I want you to hold as we think about the theological significance of this tradition for early Christian communities. If the Watcher story explains the origin of demons, then it also explains something about the nature of Jesus' ministry. When Jesus casts out an unclean spirit in a synagogue in Mark chapter 1, or among the tombs in Mark chapter 5, he is, within this theological framework, addressing the ongoing consequences of the original Watcher transgression. The demons are the long tail of that ancient catastrophe. They represent the continuing presence of the pre-flood corruption in the post-flood world. And Jesus' authority over them is, in this reading, a sign that the cosmic restoration begun by the archangels, the binding of the Watchers, the cleansing of the earth through the flood, is being extended and completed. The dominion that the Nephilim spirits exercise over suffering humanity is being broken, one encounter at a time, by someone who has authority over the entire hierarchy of spiritual power. Clinton Arnold makes exactly this point in Powers of Darkness, and I find it genuinely illuminating. As we draw toward the close of this chapter, I want to gather what we have sat with tonight. First, Enoch chapters 15 and 16 present one of the most specific and coherent answers to the question of demonic origin that ancient literature offers. The spirits of the Nephilim, whose hybrid nature left them without a proper home in either the heavenly or the earthly domains, she remained as disembodied evil spirits after their physical deaths, afflicting and oppressing humanity. Jubilees, chapter 10, then describes a negotiated arrangement in which most of these spirits are bound, but a portion remain free, not as an oversight, but as a bounded provision within divine governance. The canonical New Testament does not confirm these specific claims, but operates within a world where they were known. And the language of unclean spirits in the Gospels and Epistles carries resonances that this tradition illuminates. Held with its proper label, extra-canonical, pseudepigraphal, enormously influential, this tradition opens real windows into how ancient communities understood the spiritual dimensions of suffering and evil. And now, let me carry you toward what comes next, because we have followed the Watcher story deep into the territory of ancient angelology and demonology. But there is a dimension of this story that we have not yet fully explored, the New Testament itself. Not just in the passing connections I have noted along the way, but directly and deliberately. The letters of Jude and Peter, the mysterious passage in 1 Peter about Christ preaching to spirits in prison, Paul's language about cosmic powers and authorities. All of these carry the weight of the Watcher tradition in ways that deserve their own careful chapter. The New Testament did not simply inherit these ideas passively. It engaged with them, applied them, and in some cases transformed them in light of the death and resurrection of Jesus. That engagement is rich, important, and, as we will see, at times genuinely surprising. That is exactly where we are headed in our next chapter together. Narrator's notes for recording. Chapters 6 to 10. Overall tone across all 5 chapters. The emotional register deepens progressively through this section. Chapter 6 carries a tone of dark revelation, teaching what should not have been taught. Chapter 7 moves into something more visceral and unsettling before pulling back to scholarly honesty. Chapter 8 lifts slightly. There is something resolving and purposeful in the archangel's response. Chapter 9 returns to solemnity, slow and weighted. Chapter 10 is the most contemplative of the 5, sitting at the intersection of ancient theology and New Testament resonance. Pacing. Chapter 6 should be measured and deliberate. The list of forbidden teachings deserves space. Chapter 7 should slow significantly during the Nephilim description and the skeleton claims clarification. Give the listener time to absorb both the tradition and the correction. Chapter 8 can move with slightly more energy in the middle sections, matching the purposeful energy of the archangel's assignments before returning to calm reflection. Chapter 9 should be the slowest chapter of the 10. It is a chapter of waiting, of darkness, of quiet confinement. The pacing should reflect that. Chapter 10 builds slowly toward its New Testament connections before settling back into gentle reflection. There is a moment that happens sometimes when you are reading a text you think you know well. A moment when a single word or a single phrase catches the light differently and you realize you have been reading past something important for years. That is what I want to invite you into tonight. We are going to spend this chapter inside the New Testament, not in 1st Enoch, not in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but in the canonical scriptures that most of us have read or heard our entire lives. And I want to show you that the Watcher tradition, the story we have been following together through all of these ancient texts, left its fingerprints on the New Testament in ways that are specific, traceable, and genuinely illuminating. This is not a matter of reading things into the text that are not there. The connections I want to walk you through tonight are ones that careful scholars, people who have spent careers in the original Greek and in the historical context of the 1st century, have identified and documented. My hope is that by the time we finish tonight, several familiar passages will feel richer, deeper, and more connected to the ancient world that produced them than they did before. Let us begin with the passage that, in my reading, most directly bridges the canonical New Testament and the Watcher tradition. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 through 20. These are some of the most debated verses in the entire New Testament. Scholars have argued about them for centuries, and I want to read them to you carefully. Peter writes that Christ, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, who formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared. Spirits in prison, days of Noah. Disobedience connected to that ancient period. When I read these verses in the context of everything we have explored together, the imprisoned watchers, bound beneath the hills of the earth in the darkness of their confinement, the resonance is immediate and powerful. Peter is describing Christ after his death and resurrection, going to proclaim as something to imprisoned spirits whose disobedience is explicitly connected to the era of Noah. That is the era of the Watchers. Now, I want to be honest with you about something, because this passage deserves honesty. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 through 20, is genuinely one of the most disputed passages in all of New Testament scholarship. Thomas Schreiner, in his careful 2003 New American Commentary treatment of 1st and 2nd Peter and Jude, acknowledges that interpreters have read this passage in at least 3 significantly different ways. Some scholars understand the imprisoned spirits as the disobedient watchers, fallen angels imprisoned since the days of Noah, and understand Christ's proclamation as a declaration of his victory over them. Others read the spirits as the souls of the people who died in the flood, and understand Christ's proclamation as an offer of post-mortem redemption. Still others read the passage as describing the pre-incarnate Christ speaking through Noah to his generation. I am not going to tell you tonight which of these interpretations is correct. That is a question I genuinely want to leave in your hands and in your own study. What I can tell you is that the Watcher interpretation has serious scholarly advocates and that it connects this passage to the entire cosmic drama we have been tracing. The connection is not invented. It is there for the careful reader to see. Jude chapter 1, verses 14 and 15 are the verses I keep returning to when I think about the relationship between 1st Enoch and the New Testament, because they are the most explicit canonical confirmation of that relationship. Jude quotes 1st Enoch chapter 1, verse 9 directly. Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones, to execute judgment on all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Then Jude verse 6, which we have discussed before, speaks of the angels who abandoned their proper domain, now held in eternal bonds under darkness. Here is what I find worth pausing over. Jude places these two references, the direct quote from 1st Enoch and the description of imprisoned watchers, side by side in the same letter, as part of the same theological argument. He is not embarrassed by 1st Enoch. He is not hedging about its authority. He treats it as carrying prophetic weight, and he uses it to make a canonical argument about judgment and accountability. That is a remarkable thing for a New Testament writer to do, and it tells us something significant about the world of ideas in which the New Testament was born. Now let me take you to two passages in Paul that I think carry the Watcher tradition's influence in a different but equally real way. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, contains the language that has become perhaps the most recognizable summary of spiritual warfare in all of Paul's writings. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Rulers, authorities, cosmic powers, spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. This is language that assumes a structured hierarchy of malevolent spiritual beings organized in tiers of authority, occupying specific positions in the cosmic order, exercising real power over the human world. The scholar N.T. Wright, in his massive 2013 Fortress Press work, Paul and the Faithfulness of God, argues that Paul's language about archons and exousiae, rulers and authorities, draws on exactly the kind of cosmic hierarchy that Second Temple Judaism described in texts like 1st Enoch. Paul is not inventing these categories. He is operating within a world where the divine council, the Watcher hierarchy, and the structured tiers of spiritual power were part of the shared theological vocabulary. Colossians chapter 2, verse 15 adds another layer to this picture. Paul writes that through the cross, God disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. Disarmed, put to open shame, triumphed over. The language is military and cosmic. It describes not just a moral victory, but a structural dismantling of the powers that had held authority. In the framework of the Watcher tradition, this language carries specific weight. The Watchers descended, taught forbidden knowledge, produced chaos and destruction, and their spiritual descendants, the Nephilim spirits, the unclean spirits of the Gospels, continued that legacy of affliction. What Paul is claiming in Colossians is that the cross decisively addressed this entire structure of corrupted spiritual power. The same framework of cosmic hierarchy that first Enoch describes as the source of the world's deepest problems is the framework within which Paul locates the cosmic significance of Christ's death. The two texts, ancient pseudepigraphal tradition and canonical apostolic letter, are speaking into the same conversation, even across centuries. Let me also bring you to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 3, because it carries one of the most arresting statements in all of Paul's letters, and it connects directly to the question of angelic judgment. Paul writes, almost in passing, as if it should be obvious to his readers, "Do you not know that we are to judge angels?" He says this while making a much smaller argument about the Corinthian Christians settling disputes among themselves, rather than taking them to outside courts. But the aside is enormous. Believers will one day judge angels. This claim assumes a tradition in which certain angels are awaiting judgment, in which their accountability has not yet been fully resolved, and in which the resurrection community of believers will somehow participate in that final reckoning. When I read that verse in the context of everything we have been exploring, the imprisoned watchers, held in darkness for the judgment of the great day, awaiting their final accounting, Paul's aside stops feeling like a throwaway comment and starts feeling like a reference to something his readers already knew about, something connected to the entire Watcher tradition and its vision of cosmic justice deferred until the end of history. Here is the broader theological picture that I want to offer as we reflect on all of this together. The New Testament writers, Peter, Jude, Paul, were not systematic theologians writing careful footnoted arguments about angelology. They were pastors, missionaries, and community leaders, writing to specific people about specific situations. When they reach for language about imprisoned spirits, about rulers and authorities, about cosmic powers and the judgment of angels, they are drawing on a reservoir of shared theological understanding that their readers already possessed. That reservoir was filled, in significant part, by traditions like the one preserved in 1 Enoch. The Watcher tradition shaped the questions that first-century Jews and Christians brought to their faith. It shaped the categories they used to understand suffering and evil. It shaped the vocabulary they reached for when they wanted to describe the cosmic scope of what Christ had accomplished. You cannot fully understand Paul's cosmic Christology, his vision of Christ as Lord over all powers and authorities, without understanding the tradition of cosmic spiritual hierarchy that he was speaking into. As we move toward the close of this chapter, I want to acknowledge something that I think is worth naming clearly. Not all scholars agree on the extent to which the Watcher tradition directly influenced New Testament language. Some argue that Paul's language about rulers and authorities refers primarily to human political powers, not spiritual beings. Some read 1 Peter chapter 3 in ways that have nothing to do with imprisoned watchers. These are real interpretive debates, conducted by serious scholars who have earned the right to their disagreement. I am not asking you to settle those debates tonight. What I am asking you to notice is that the Watcher tradition is at minimum a credible and well-documented lens through which these passages can be read, one that illuminates specific details, explains specific choices of language, and connects the New Testament to its deep roots in Second Temple Jewish theology. Whether you ultimately embrace that reading or hold it loosely, knowing it exists makes you a more informed reader of your New Testament. Now let me carry you toward our next chapter, because we are about to make what I think is the most surprising detour of our entire journey. We have traveled from the Book of Daniel to 1st Enoch to the New Testament epistles. And now I want to take you somewhere none of those texts might have prepared you to go, directly into the Book of Leviticus, into the liturgical heart of the Mosaic Law, where a single annual ritual and a single uninterpreted word may have preserved the name of a watcher chief inside the most sacred worship calendar of ancient Israel. The word is Azazel. You have heard that name before, in 1st Enoch, as the chief watcher who taught the arts of warfare and metalworking, who was bound by Raphael and cast into the desert darkness. But Azazel appears again in a completely different context, and the canonical Bible never explains what it means. Tonight, we are going to sit with that mystery together. I want to take you tonight to the most sacred day in the ancient Israelite calendar, a day so weighty, so carefully prescribed, so dense with ritual action that the ancient rabbis said the entire world's fate hung in the balance during its observance. This is the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, described in extraordinary detail in Leviticus chapter 16. On this day, the high priest of Israel entered the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary of the tabernacle, the place where God's presence was understood to dwell, and performed a series of rituals designed to cleanse the sanctuary, the priests, and all of Israel from the accumulated weight of a year's worth of sin and impurity. It is one of the most theologically rich passages in the entire Torah, and buried within its precise, carefully ordered instructions is a detail so strange and so unexplained that scholars have debated it for 2,000 years. 2 goats are brought before the high priest. One is sacrificed to God. The other is sent away into the wilderness, carrying the sins of all Israel on its head, for something the Hebrew text calls La Azazel, and the Torah never tells us what Azazel is. Let me show you exactly what the text says, because the specificity of Leviticus chapter 16 is both its power and its puzzle. Verse 8 reads, "And Aaron shall cast lots over the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord, and the other lot for Azazel." Verse 10, "But the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away into the wilderness to Azazel." Verse 26, "And he who lets the goat go to Azazel shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and afterward he may come into the camp." Look at the structure of verse 8 very carefully. One lot goes to the Lord. The other lot goes to Azazel. The ritual draws a direct parallel between these 2 destinations. What is sent to the Lord is a sacrifice, an offering within the normal framework of Israelite worship. What is sent to Azazel is something different, a live goat bearing the transferred sins of the entire nation, sent into the wilderness toward this unnamed, unexplained destination. The text presents these as paired categories, and it never explains what or who Azazel is. The Hebrew word itself, Azazel, has generated more scholarly debate about its etymology and meaning than perhaps any other single term in the Torah. The King James Bible, translated in 1611, famously did not transliterate the name at all. It rendered the phrase "for the scapegoat," turning a proper name into a description. That translation decision has shaped the English-speaking world's understanding of this ritual ever since. And it is why most people say scapegoat without having any idea that they are talking about what may be an ancient name. The English Standard Version, the New American Standard Bible, and several other modern translations restore the name, rendering the phrase "for Azazel," which is much closer to what the Hebrew actually says. Jacob Milgrom, one of the greatest Leviticus scholars of the 20th century, whose 3-volume Anchor Bible commentary on Leviticus, published in 1991, is still considered the definitive modern treatment of the text, argues directly and carefully that Azazel in Leviticus chapter 16 is a demon name, not a place, not an abstract description, a name, specifically the name of a wilderness demon to whom the sin-laden goat is being dispatched. Now, I want to hold the weight of that scholarly argument carefully, because it is significant. Milgram is not a fringe figure reading ancient mythology into the Torah. He is a rigorous, deeply respected biblical scholar, making a careful linguistic and contextual case. His argument is that the structure of verse 8, one lot for the Lord, one lot for Azazel, makes most grammatical and theological sense if Azazel is a proper name denoting a real entity, parallel to but subordinate to God. The ritual is not offering worship to Azazel. It is not a pagan sacrifice to a demon. It is something more nuanced. It is a ritual act of sending the sins of Israel back to their demonic source. As Milgram frames it, a symbolic act of cosmic cleansing in which evil is returned to the one associated with its origin. Baruch Levine, another major Leviticus scholar, whose JPS Torah commentary volume on Leviticus was published in 1989, also engages seriously with the Azazel question and understands him as a wilderness demon figure. These are mainstream academic positions, not fringes of scholarship. Here is where 1st Enoch enters this conversation in a way that I find genuinely electrifying. We have already spent time with 1st Enoch's account of Azazel, the Watcher leader who taught humanity the arts of metalworking for weapons and the use of cosmetics for seduction, who was bound by the archangel Raphael and cast into the desert at a place called Dudael, covered with rocks in darkness, awaiting the final judgment. 1st Enoch, chapter 10, verses 4 through 8, describes Azazel's punishment as specifically connected to the desert wilderness, the same environment to which the Leviticus scapegoat is sent. When you place these two traditions side by side, the canonical Leviticus ritual and the pseudepigraphal 1st Enoch narrative, a picture emerges that is remarkable in its coherence. The goat goes to the wilderness, to Azazel, to the place of his imprisonment and exile. The sins of Israel are sent back to the being who, in the Enochic tradition, was responsible for introducing forbidden knowledge into the human world. It is as though the Leviticus ritual carries a memory, encoded in its liturgical action, if not in its written explanation, of the same Azazel that 1st Enoch describes. Now I must be careful here, and I want to be, because intellectual honesty requires it. The connection between Leviticus's Azazel and 1st Enoch's Azazel is an interpretive argument, a compelling one, a well-documented one, but an argument nonetheless. The Torah does not tell us that its Azazel is the same figure as 1st Enoch's fallen watcher. Leviticus 16 does not cite the Enochic tradition or explain its own use of the name. The connection is made by scholars who observe the parallel and find it persuasive, and it may well be that both texts are drawing on the same ancient tradition of a wilderness demon named Azazel that predates both the Torah's composition and 1st Enoch's writing. What we can say, honestly, is this. The name Azazel appears in Leviticus chapter 16 as the designation for the destination of the sin-bearing goat. The word is never explained in the canonical text. The most linguistically careful reading of the passage suggests it is a proper name referring to an entity, and that same name appears in 1st Enoch as the name of the most destructive of the fallen watchers. The coherence between these two traditions is real, and it has led serious scholars in both Jewish and Christian traditions to treat the connection as historically meaningful. The Mishnah, the rabbinic legal compilation, recorded around 200 of the Common Era, describes in Tractate Yoma, chapter 6, how the scapegoat ritual was actually carried out in the Second Temple period. The goat was not simply released into the open wilderness to wander. A designated man led it to a specific location, identified in the Mishnah as Beit Hadudo, and there pushed it off a cliff to its death. The text describes the cliffs as rough and jagged, and the goat dying in the fall. When I read that Second Temple description, alongside First Enoch's account of Azazel, bound and cast into a rough and rocky wilderness place, the parallel in texture and imagery is arresting. A rough place, a rocky location, a casting into the wild. The traditions seem to be drawing on a shared imaginative landscape, a shared understanding of what the wilderness represented as a place of demonic exile and divine judgment. This does not prove that the Second Temple practitioners understood the ritual the way First Enoch understands Azazel, but it does show that the wilderness, the rocks, and the casting all belong together in the ancient imagination around this figure. Let me offer a theological reflection that I think is worth sitting with quietly. If the Leviticus Azazel and the first Enoch Azazel are indeed connected, if the Day of Atonement ritual carries within it a memory of the cosmic transgression of the Watchers, then the most sacred moment in the Israelite liturgical year contains a gesture of cosmic resolution. The sins of the nation are gathered, transferred onto the head of the goat, and sent back to the very source of the knowledge and corruption that made those sins possible. It is not a propitiation of Azazel, not worship, not tribute, not acknowledgement of his power. It is a reversal, a sending back, a symbolic act that says, "This belongs to you, not to us." The evil we have done, the corruption we have inherited, the weight of all we have become in a year of human failure. We send it back to the wilderness, to the darkness, to the place of your confinement. There is a kind of theological poetry in that gesture that moves me when I sit with it. The Israelite priests, year after year, enacting what may be an ancient memory of the Watcher tradition, not by worshipping a fallen being, but by ritually stripping his influence from the community and returning it to him. As we come toward the end of this chapter, I want to pause on what we have seen tonight and let it settle. Azazel appears in Leviticus chapter 16, verses 8, 10, and 26, as the destination of the sin-bearing scapegoat on the Day of Atonement. An unexplained name, a parallel to God in the structure of the text, pointing toward the wilderness. The most careful scholarship on Leviticus, Milgram and Levine among others, treats this as a proper name for a demon or wilderness entity. First Enoch, chapter 8 and chapter 10, describe Azazel as the chief of the fallen watchers, the teacher of the most destructive forbidden arts, bound and exiled to a rocky desert darkness. The Mishnah's description of the Second Temple practice places the goat in a rough, cliff-edged wilderness location that echoes First Enoch's description of Azazel's prison. All of these pieces are different things: canonical scripture, scholarly interpretation, pseudepigraphal tradition, rabbinic description, and they each carry their proper label. But together they form a picture that is remarkably coherent, remarkably old, and remarkably worth knowing. Now I want to carry you forward into the final section of our journey, because we have traveled through the ancient world of the Watchers from their first appearance in Daniel to their canonical echoes in Leviticus. What remains is the long story of how this tradition was received, how it was preserved, suppressed, adapted, and transformed across 2,000 years of Jewish and then Christian history. We will move next into the world of post-biblical Jewish tradition, where Rabbinic Judaism made a deliberate and fascinating choice about the Watcher stories, a choice that shaped what most Jewish readers have known about angels and their fall ever since. That story is quieter than the ones we have been telling, but it is in its own way just as important, because the decision about what to remember and what to set aside is itself a theological act. And understanding that act helps us see the full picture of where this ancient tradition has lived and breathed across the centuries. There is a kind of story that is not about events, but about what happens to ideas after the events that produced them are over. Tonight, we are going to follow that kind of story. The story of what happened to the Watcher tradition after the canonical biblical texts were written, after the Dead Sea Scrolls were buried in their caves, after the Second Temple period gave way to the long and transformative centuries that followed. Specifically, we are going to look at what happened to the Watchers in the hands of the rabbinic tradition, the great teachers and legal scholars whose work shaped the form of Judaism that survived the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple in 70 of the Common Era, and that has continued in various forms to this day. And the short answer is this: the rabbinic tradition, on the whole, pulled back from the Watcher stories. Not completely, not always, but substantially. The rich, vivid angelology of First Enoch, the descending Watchers, the named archangels, the forbidden teachings, the imprisoned spirits, was handled with increasing caution by the rabbis, and understanding why they made that choice tells us something important about how communities decide what to do with their own dangerous and powerful stories. The place to start is Genesis Rabbah, the great rabbinic commentary on the Book of Genesis, probably compiled in its present form around the 5th century of the Common Era, but drawing on much older traditions. Genesis Rabbah, chapter 26, section 5, deals directly with the phrase sons of God in Genesis chapter 6, the very phrase that launched the entire Watcher tradition. And what does it say? It interprets the sons of God as judges, dayanim, the Hebrew word for human legal authorities. In this reading, the sons of God are not celestial beings at all. They are powerful men, human rulers, who abused their authority and took women by force or by coercion. This is a deliberate reinterpretation, a move away from the angelic reading that dominated the earlier period and toward a thoroughly human explanation. The rabbis are not ignoring the difficulty of Genesis 6. They are answering it in a way that keeps the focus on human responsibility and human sin, rather than opening the door to a rich tradition of fallen angels and demonic offspring that they seem to have regarded with increasing suspicion. The Babylonian Talmud, that enormous and extraordinarily important compilation of rabbinic legal discussion and narrative, engages with Azazel in Tractata Yoma, chapter 67, column B. This section discusses the Leviticus 16 ritual, and it acknowledges the name Azazel directly, but the treatment is notably restrained. The Talmudic discussion does not identify Azazel as a demon. It does not connect the name to the Watcher tradition of First Enoch. It treats the term, essentially, as a place name, a designation for the destination of the goat, rather than as a proper name for a spiritual being. This is a significant choice, and I think it reflects the broader rabbinic tendency of this period to contain and manage the more elaborate angelic traditions of Second Temple Judaism, rather than develop them further. The Talmud is not suppressing Azazel. The name is right there in the canonical Torah and cannot be ignored. But it is declining to build on the Enochic tradition that gave Azazel his full identity. Why did the rabbinic tradition make these choices? The scholar Philip Alexander, in his contribution to the 2005 Eerdmans collection, Enoch and Qumran Origins, offers a compelling answer. He argues that the Enochic tradition and the Mosaic tradition represented rival streams of authority within Second Temple Judaism, different ways of grounding religious knowledge, different centers of theological gravity. First, Enoch builds its authority on the figure of Enoch, the mysterious pre-flood patriarch who walked with God and was taken. The Torah builds its authority on Moses, the great lawgiver to whom God spoke directly and who delivered the covenant at Sinai. For the rabbinic tradition that emerged after the temple's destruction, Moses and the Torah were the unambiguous center, the anchor around which all Jewish life would be reorganized in a world without a temple. In that context, the elevation of an Enochic tradition that operated outside the Mosaic framework was not just a theological risk. It was a challenge to the very structure of authority that the rabbinic project was trying to build. There is another dimension to this that James van der Kam's work on Enoch helps us understand. Van der Kam notes in Enoch, a man for all generations, that first Enoch was particularly associated with sectarian Jewish communities, groups like the Qumran community, whose library included multiple Enoch manuscripts, and who operated at some remove from the mainstream temple establishment. When those sectarian communities were scattered by the Roman destruction of 70 CE, and when the rabbinic tradition set about rebuilding Jewish religious life in the aftermath, there was a natural tendency to distance the emerging mainstream from traditions associated with the sects. First Enoch, beloved at Qumran, may have become suspect precisely because of that association. This does not mean the rabbis consciously decided to suppress it for political reasons. It means that the tradition's connections to communities, now gone, and movements now discredited, made it easier to let it recede into the background of Jewish religious life. And yet, and this is something I find genuinely fascinating, the Watcher tradition did not disappear entirely from Jewish thought. It went underground, transformed, resurfaced in new forms. The Zohar, the foundational text of the Kabbalistic tradition, compiled in 13th century Spain and attributed to the ancient sage Shimon bar Yochai, takes up themes from the Watcher and Nephilim traditions and weaves them into the elaborate mystical cosmology of Kabbalah. The fallen angels reappear in Kabbalistic thought under different names, in different frameworks, serving different theological purposes, but clearly drawing on the same ancient reservoir of ideas. This tells us something important. The questions that the Watcher tradition addressed. Where did evil come from? What is the nature of the heavenly world? How do divine beings and human beings intersect? Were questions that Jewish thinkers could not stop asking, no matter what the mainstream tradition officially decided about First Enoch's authority. The stories that answer the deepest questions have a way of surviving even official decisions to set them aside. I want to offer a broader reflection here about what the rabbinic handling of the Watcher tradition teaches us about how religious communities relate to their own difficult stories. Every tradition has material within it that is powerful, potentially dangerous, and resistant to easy domestication. The Watcher stories are exactly that kind of material. Vivid, cosmic, concerned with the origin of evil, populated with beings of enormous power, making catastrophic choices. Different communities in different periods have handled this material differently. The Qumran community embraced it and made it central. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church canonized it. The rabbinic mainstream pulled back from it. The early Christians engaged with it and then gradually set it aside as the Church's canon crystallized. And none of these responses is simply right or wrong. Each reflects a community making considered decisions about which stories best serve their needs, their identity, and their understanding of what is true and authoritative. Understanding all of these responses makes us wiser readers of the tradition as a whole. What the Qumran archaeological findings tell us, and I think this is worth naming clearly, is that the suppression of First Enoch was never total and never universal. The caves at Qumran yielded fragments of First Enoch in Aramaic, 4Q201 and 4Q202 and related manuscripts, confirming that in the century or so before the Common Era, communities were copying and preserving this text with great care. The physical labor of copying manuscripts in the ancient world was enormous. Scribes worked slowly, carefully, with precious materials. You did not copy a text you did not value. The Qumran community's investment in First Enoch tells us that for them, this was not marginal material. It was central, and what they preserved in those desert caves eventually came back into the light in 1947, giving modern scholars access to traditions that Rabbinic Judaism had largely set aside and that most of the Christian world had forgotten. There is something quietly remarkable about that. The desert itself preserved what the institutions did not. As we draw toward the close of this chapter, I want to gather the threads of what we have followed tonight. The rabbinic tradition, working to rebuild Jewish life after the destruction of the Second Temple, largely moved away from the elaborate angelology of First Enoch. Genesis Rabbah reinterpreted the sons of God as human judges. The Babylonian Talmud treated Azazel as a place rather than a person. The Enochic tradition was effectively sidelined from mainstream Jewish religious life, though it continued to surface in Kabbalistic thought centuries later. Philip Alexander's argument that the Enochic and Mosaic traditions represented rival Second Temple streams helps explain this. The rabbinic tradition chose its center, and First Enoch was not it. But the Dead Sea Scrolls remind us that this choice was not universal, and that the traditions the rabbis set aside were treasured by communities who found in them genuine answers to genuine questions. All of this is true at once, and holding it together without forcing a simple verdict on anyone is the most honest thing we can do with this history. And now I want to move us into our next chapter, which follows the same story into a different community, the early Christian church, and its own complex, evolving engagement with the Watcher tradition. Because for the first several centuries of Christianity, the Watcher stories were not suppressed or sidelined. They were alive, active, and influential. Early church fathers quoted them, argued about them, and built theological positions on them. And then, gradually, a shift happened. A shift associated in particular with one enormously influential theologian, whose reading of Genesis chapter 6 changed the trajectory of Western Christian interpretation for over 1,000 years. That story of theological consensus forming, shifting, and eventually settling is exactly where we are headed next. There is a version of Christian history that presents the early church as a single, unified voice, speaking consistently about all theological matters from the very beginning. I have great affection for the early church, and I have spent a lot of time in its writings, but I want to tell you honestly tonight that this picture is not accurate, and the Watcher tradition is one of the clearest examples of why. For the first 3 centuries of Christianity, the question of what happened in Genesis chapter 6, who the sons of God were, what they did, what resulted from it, was answered by most serious Christian thinkers in a way that would surprise many modern readers. They read it exactly the way First Enoch read it. They believed that divine beings descended, took human wives, and produced monstrous offspring. And they used this belief as a theological foundation for understanding the origin of evil, the nature of demons, and the danger of certain kinds of spiritual knowledge. This was not a fringe position. It was, for the first 2 centuries of the church, the dominant one. And then, gradually, it changed. And the change tells us something important about how theology develops under pressure. Justin Martyr wrote around 150 of the Common Era, making him one of the earliest Christian apologists. Writers who defended Christian faith to outside audiences using careful philosophical argument. In his second apology, chapter 5, Justin writes with complete confidence that angels sinned with women and that demons are the offspring of those unions. He presents this as established and obvious, not as a controversial claim requiring careful defense. What strikes me about Justin's treatment is exactly that casualness. He assumes his readers know this tradition and accept it. He is building a different argument on top of it, using the Watcher tradition as a foundation stone rather than as the point itself. This tells us that by the middle of the 2nd century, the angel interpretation of Genesis 6 was so well established in Christian communities that a careful apologist could simply reference it in passing while making a larger point. It was common ground. Tertullian, one of the most important and colourful theologians of the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, engaged with the Watcher tradition in ways that are both fascinating and, from a modern perspective, sometimes startling. In his work on the Veiling of Virgins, chapter 7, and Tertullian invokes the Watcher tradition directly. Specifically, the idea that the Watchers were drawn to human women, in part because of their appearance and adornment, as an argument for why Christian women should veil themselves in public worship. He is using the theological framework of angelic transgression to make a very practical liturgical argument. Now, I want to be clear that Tertullian's specific application of this theology carries its own problems and reflects the cultural assumptions of his time in ways we should name honestly. But what his use of the tradition tells us is that in the early 3rd century, the Watcher narrative was not merely an abstract theological curiosity. It was live enough, real enough, and established enough that a major theologian reached for it as a foundation for practical instruction. The Watchers were not a distant mythology for Tertullian. They were a theological reality with immediate practical implications. Origen, writing in the middle of the 3rd century, is a more complex figure in this story. His work Against Celsus, chapter 5, section 52, engages with the Watcher tradition in a way that is notably more careful and more qualified than what we find in Justin or Tertullian. Origen acknowledges the tradition and interacts with it, but he handles the more extreme elements with greater caution, more inclined toward allegorical or spiritual readings than toward the literal physical descent that 1st Enoch describes. Origen was one of the most sophisticated biblical interpreters of the ancient world, deeply influenced by Greek philosophical categories, and his instinct was always to find the deeper spiritual meaning beneath the literal surface of a text. This does not mean Origen rejected the Watcher tradition outright. He engaged with it seriously. But his more cautious engagement prefigures the shift that was coming in the following century, when the literal angel interpretation would come under sustained pressure from the most influential theologian of the Western Church. That theologian is Augustine of Hippo, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. His work, The City of God, chapter 15, section 23, contains the argument that changed the course of Western Christian interpretation of Genesis chapter 6. Augustine looked carefully at the tradition of angels marrying human women and producing giant offspring, and he found it theologically troubling. His specific concern was what we might call the mechanics of such a union. How could spiritual beings engage in physical reproduction? He found the Sethite interpretation more theologically coherent. The sons of God are the godly men of Seth's lineage. The daughters of men are women from the corrupt line of Cain. and the resulting moral compromise explains the spread of corruption without requiring any transgression of the boundary between heavenly and earthly beings. Augustine's reading was careful, his theological instincts were serious, and his influence in the Western Church was enormous. Once Augustine wrote, Western Christianity largely followed him, and the angel interpretation, so dominant in the first 3 centuries, gradually receded from the mainstream. The scholar David Forsyth, in his 1987 Princeton University Press work, The Old Enemy, Satan and the Combat Myth, traces how the early church's engagement with the angelic fall tradition shaped the development of Christian concepts about Satan and cosmic evil more broadly. What Forsyth's work helps us see is that the Watcher tradition did not enter early Christianity simply as a story about angels. It entered as a cosmological framework, a way of understanding the structured nature of spiritual evil and the cosmic dimensions of the conflict between good and evil. Early Christian thinkers who embraced the literal Watcher tradition were not just reading Genesis 6 in a particular way. They were constructing an entire theology of cosmic conflict that placed Christ's work within a vast drama of spiritual rebellion, divine response, and ultimate restoration. When Augustine shifted the interpretation of Genesis 6, he was not just making a different exegetical choice. He was, over time, contributing to a shift in the entire cosmological framework of Western Christianity. What I find genuinely worth sitting with here is a historical irony that I think is important to name honestly. The tradition that dominated the first 3 centuries of Christianity, the literal angel interpretation, grounded in both 1st Enoch and canonical texts like Jude and 2nd Peter, is, in terms of sheer historical proximity to the New Testament, the older and earlier tradition. Justin Martyr was closer in time to the apostles than Augustine was. The communities that first read Jude's direct quotation of 1st Enoch were closer in cultural context to the world that produced both texts. The Sethite interpretation, which most Western Christians today assume is the obviously correct reading, is actually the later development. It came to dominance through Augustine's influence, not through earlier unanimity. This does not mean the Sethite interpretation is wrong. It means that the history of how we arrived at it is more complicated than most people realize, and that the confidence with which it is sometimes presented as the only serious Christian reading overstates the actual historical consensus. Let me offer a moment of theological reflection that feels important here. The fact that early Christianity contained genuine diversity of interpretation on a question as significant as the origin of evil and the nature of angelic transgression is not, in my view, a sign of theological weakness. It is a sign of the extraordinary richness and depth of the tradition these early thinkers were engaging with. They were reading very old texts, asking very hard questions, working with limited tools, and arriving at different answers, because the texts themselves genuinely support different readings. What that diversity invites us to do, us, the people reading and listening tonight, centuries after all these debates unfolded, is to hold our own interpretive positions with a degree of humility. Not uncertainty about the things that matter most, but humility about the things that remain genuinely open. The Watcher tradition in early Christianity is one of those places where humility serves us better than false confidence. As we come toward the close of this chapter, let me gather the story we have followed tonight. For the first 2 to 3 centuries of Christianity, the dominant reading of Genesis chapter 6 among serious Christian thinkers was the angel interpretation. Divine beings descended, took human wives, and produced offspring whose spirits became demons. Justin Martyr in his second Apology, Tertullian in On the Veiling of Virgins, and others built on this tradition as established common ground. Origen engaged with it more cautiously, with greater allegorical inclination. Augustine, in the City of God, turned decisively toward the Sethite interpretation, and given his enormous influence in the Western Church, changed the trajectory of mainstream Christian reading for over 1,000 years. The scholar David Forsyth helps us see how these interpretive choices shape the entire cosmological framework within which Western Christianity understood Satan, evil, and cosmic conflict. All of this is genuinely historical, documented in texts we can still read, traceable across centuries we can still map. Now I want to bring you to our final chapter, and I want to do so with a sense of genuine arrival, because what we have been building toward across all of these chapters is a question that the tradition itself insists must be asked. If the Watchers are imprisoned, if their imprisonment is confirmed by both 1st Enoch and the canonical letters of Peter and Jude, if the timeline of their confinement stretches to a great day of judgment, then what happens on that day? What does the final reckoning of the Watcher tradition look like? What do the texts, canonical and extra-canonical alike, actually say about the ultimate fate of these beings who descended from their station, taught forbidden knowledge, filled the world with violence, and now wait in the dark? That question is the last one we will sit with together. And I think the answer, when we let all the texts speak at once, is one of the most quietly powerful things in this entire ancient story. There is something about endings that the human spirit cannot stop reaching toward. We read stories because we need to know how they resolve. We follow ancient texts through generations of scholarship and tradition because somewhere in us we believe that the questions they raise deserve final answers. Tonight, we come to the last chapter of our journey together, and in a very real sense, it is a chapter about last things, about endings, about the resolution that the Watcher tradition insists is coming but has not yet arrived. Everything we have explored together over these 15 chapters has been building in its own way toward this moment. The moment when the imprisonment is over, when the judgment day the ancient texts promised finally comes, when the full weight of what happened in those antediluvian years before the flood is finally brought to account. I want to walk through this with you gently tonight, because the tone of this final chapter is not triumphalist or dramatic. It is solemn and slow, and in its own quiet way, deeply consoling. These texts are not just stories about ancient beings. They are, at their heart, at sheer promise about the nature of justice in a world where justice has often seemed impossibly deferred. Let us begin with 1st Enoch, chapter 10, verses 12 through 14, because this is where the ancient writer makes his most explicit statement about the timeline of the Watcher's imprisonment. The text says that after the archangels bind the fallen Watchers in the valleys of the earth, they are to remain there for 70 generations, until the day of their judgment and consummation. Then, the text says, they will be led away to the fiery abyss and to the torment of their imprisonment for all eternity. The language here shifts from the imagery of underground confinement to the imagery of fire and final sentence. What strikes me about this passage is the sense of deliberate structure it carries. The imprisonment is not permanent in the sense of being the final punishment. It is, rather, a holding condition, a waiting room before a court of final judgment that has not yet convened. The 70 generations are a symbolic measure of time pointing to the end of the present age. And when that age ends, the temporary confinement gives way to a final reckoning that is explicitly described as eternal in its consequences. 1st Enoch chapter 16, verse 1, adds to this picture by addressing the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, the evil spirits whose activity we explored when we examined the origin of demons. The text sets their period of active operation as lasting until the day of consummation, the great judgment. This is the same eschatological horizon that bounds the Watcher's imprisonment. Both the imprisoned Watchers themselves and the roaming spirits of their offspring are operating within a bounded time, a period of delay before the final judgment that will resolve everything. What I find theologically profound about this parallel is what it suggests about the nature of the present moment in the tradition's own framework. We are living in First Enoch's cosmological picture, in the time between the original Watcher transgression and the Great Judgment. The evil that was set in motion then is still active now. The spirits still roam, the Watchers still wait. But this is not the permanent state of things. It is a temporary condition within a larger story that has a definitive ending. Now let me bring you back to the canonical New Testament, because this is where the eschatological vision of the Watcher tradition makes its clearest connection to the scriptures most of us know well. Jude verse 6, which we have visited before, describes the fallen angels as kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. That phrase, the judgment of the great day, perfectly mirrors the language of First Enoch. Jude is not just referencing an imprisonment, he is referencing a postponed judgment, a deferred reckoning, a day that has been set but has not yet arrived. And 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4 echoes this precisely. The sinning angels are committed to pits of gloomy darkness, to be kept until the judgment. The word until is doing enormous theological work in both of these verses. It is not forever. It is not resolved. It is not finished. It is until. These beings wait in the dark for a verdict that is certain but not yet delivered. The certainty of that coming judgment is, in both Peter and Jude's arguments, the foundation for confidence that the justice of God is real and that it will ultimately extend to every wrongdoing, every transgression, every act of cosmic rebellion, no matter how ancient, no matter how powerful the beings who committed it. Revelation chapter 12, verse 7, gives us a canonical glimpse of the cosmic conflict dimension of this eschatological picture, though I want to be careful about how I present it. The passage describes Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, the great cosmic adversary, and the dragon and his angels being thrown down. The scholar G. K. Beale, in his magisterial 1999 New International Greek Testament Commentary on Revelation, published by Eerdmans, argues carefully that Revelation's imagery of cosmic warfare draws on exactly the tradition of angelic rebellion and divine response that we have been tracing throughout our study. The dragon's angels who are cast down echo the watchers who descended from their station. The cosmic war in heaven echoes the divine response to the watcher transgression. Michael's role as the champion who leads the heavenly armies against the rebellious cosmic powers echoes the Michael of First Enoch, who was charged with binding Shemihaza and dealing with the consequences of the watcher's fall. Revelation is not simply retelling First Enoch. It is a canonical text with its own distinct theological vision. But that vision moves through the same cosmological territory and reaches toward the same eschatological resolution. There is one more canonical text I want to bring to you in this final chapter, because I think it carries the most intimate and perhaps most surprising connection between the Watcher tradition and the New Testament's vision of final things. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 3. That brief, startling aside from Paul that we noted earlier in our journey. Paul writes to the Corinthian Christians, "Do you not know that we are to judge angels?" He says it as though it should be obvious, as though they already know this. The context is a practical argument about resolving disputes within the community, but the underlying claim is cosmic in its implications. The resurrection community, ordinary human believers who have been united with Christ, will one day participate in the judgment of angels. When I read that verse in the full context of everything we have explored together, the imprisoned watchers awaiting the judgment of the great day, the elaborate cosmic drama of their fall and its consequences, Paul's aside becomes almost overwhelming in its scope. The humans who were diminished, corrupted, afflicted, and oppressed by the Watcher, transgression and its consequences, will one day sit in judgment over the beings responsible for it. The victims, in the end, will be among the judges. Let me offer a reflection on what the final judgment of the Watchers means within the broader theological vision these texts are building. Across 1 Enoch, Jude, 2 Peter, and the wider New Testament, the judgment that is coming is not presented primarily as vengeance. It is presented as resolution, the closing of an account that has been open for an extraordinarily long time, the answering of cries that have been rising from the earth since before the flood. 1 Enoch chapter 9 describes the archangels reporting to God the full account of what the Watchers did and what the earth suffered as a result. God's response set in motion both the immediate judgment, the binding and imprisonment, and the promise of a final judgment still to come. The entirety of human history after that moment, in the tradition's own framework, has been lived within the shadow of that deferred judgment. The evil spirits roam, the watchers wait in darkness. But the account is not closed. The great day is coming, and when it comes, the tradition promises, it will be thorough. Not one act of transgression, not one consequence of the Watcher fall will remain unaddressed. I want to speak honestly about the interpretive care this kind of material requires. Mapping 1 Enoch's specific timeline, 70 generations to the Day of Judgment, onto Revelation's eschatological vision, or onto Paul's language about judging angels, is a move that requires real caution. These are different texts from different periods with different purposes and different audiences. The scholar G.K. Beale's careful work on Revelation is valuable precisely because he traces genuine connections without forcing false harmonizations. What we can say honestly is that the eschatological vision of the Watcher tradition, judgment deferred, justice certain, the great day coming, is consistent with the canonical New Testament's own eschatological vision, even where the specific details differ. The tradition and the canon are moving in the same direction, toward a final resolution of the cosmic drama that began when divine beings abandoned their station and the world was changed forever. Now I want to spend a moment simply sitting with the full arc of the story we have followed together across these 15 chapters. We began with a single Aramaic word in the Book of Daniel, the wakeful one. We moved through the divine counsel of Psalm 82 and the heavenly assembly of Job chapter 1, understanding the ordered cosmos in which the watchers held their place. We read the 6 spare verses of Genesis chapter 6 and felt the weight of their deliberate ambiguity. We entered the world of 1 Enoch, its origins, its authority, its canonical quotation in Jude, and we followed its narrative of descent, forbidden knowledge, violence, and divine response. We watched the archangels receive their assignments and carry them out. We followed the watchers into their imprisonment, traced the Nephilim spirits into their roaming existence as demons, and heard their story echoing through the letters of the New Testament. We sat with Azazel in the heart of Leviticus. We followed the tradition through its suppression in rabbinic Judaism and its remarkable vitality in early Christianity. And now we have arrived at the ending, the tradition itself points toward. The great day, the final judgment, the closing of the ancient account. As we come to the very end of our journey together, I want to leave you with something simple, but I think genuinely true. The story of the Watchers is not ultimately a story about powerful beings doing terrible things. It is a story about justice, about the ancient human conviction that wrongdoing of any kind, even wrongdoing by the most powerful beings in the cosmos, does not go permanently unaddressed. The Watchers are bound. They wait. The day is coming when everything set in motion by their transgression will be finally and completely resolved. First, Enoch believed that. Jude believed that. Peter believed that. And the ancient communities who copied these texts by hand in desert caves, by lamplight, in the face of empires that threatened to crush them, they believed it too. They found comfort in it, not because they were naive, but because they had looked at the world honestly and found it full of evidence that justice was needed and deferred and real. The Watcher's story ends not with chaos, but with order restored, with the promise that the cosmic account will one day be settled, with the quiet and sovereign certainty that the great day is coming. And I find that, in its own ancient and solemn way, one of the most consoling things these old texts have to offer.